no longer feeling the need to even keep up pretenses. We were supposed to gather here to discuss how an entire civilian population who had survived a genocide and with still immense needs was yet again confronted with fuel and electricity being cut off, leading to the shutdown of essential water and sewage treatment facilities, worsening the already dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza, so-called evacuation orders to advance forcible displacement, and all this coupled with the hermetic siege denying the entire civilian Palestinian population life-saving aid since the beginning of the month. Now, we gather here after a series of deadly Israeli attacks that killed last night alone hundreds of Palestinians. Current reports indicating over 400 killed and nearly 600 injured in the span of few hours during the night last night. Reminiscent of the criminal bombardments our people endured for over 15 months. The same images are back to haunt us. Small children on Garnia's little siblings, injured and disoriented, trying to comfort and reassure each other. Entire families killed, children, mothers, fathers, searching for their loved ones under the rubble, not knowing if they are dead or alive. Bombardments, death, devastation, fire, and fear are yet again spreading throughout the Gaza Strip. And this is all happening during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, 1 year after the councils chose this same period, given its significance, to call for the first time for a ceasefire to hold the genocide and stem unimaginable human suffering. In our tradition, nobody would fight during the month of Ramadan. This is from the beginning of time. But yet, the criminals, cruel, selfish leaders of the government of Israel, of the occupying authorities, do these things in spite of traditions and respect for religion and humanity. Madam President, Palestinians are being killed indiscriminately, are being denied humanitarian aid indiscriminately, are being maimed and detained indiscriminately. We condemn these crimes in the strongest possible terms. This can never be justified and must stop immediately. Must stop immediately. And I agree with you, Madam President, when you said that you have a responsibility around the table to act. You are the Security Council. Act. Stop this criminal action. Stop them from denying our people food in the month of Ramadan and water and the hospitals to operate. Act. You have resolutions. Act. You have power. Act. Or, as my friend, the ambassador of Slovenia said, you become irrelevant. Act according to the power given to you by the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, ceasefire works. It is the only thing that does. It stopped the bloodshed. It allowed the entry of humanitarian aid Israel had long denied. It allowed the release of hostages and prisoners. It allowed for the starving people to be given sustenance, for the sick and wounded to receive medical care, as the tenets of international humanitarian law and our very humanity oblige. Life was starting to triumph over death. Our collective role is to ensure life prevails, and that requires ensuring the full and effective implementation of Resolution 2735. Resolution 2735 is unequivocal. It clearly spells out the terms of each phase and the obligations of each side. It also clearly states in relations to phase two, which includes release of hostages and full withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from Gaza, that the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations continue. And negotiations will keep going until all the agreements are reached and phase two is able to begin. There should not be unilateral, self-serving, and irresponsible decisions to execute breaking the ceasefire. While the Trump administration has prioritized the release of hostages, it is evident that Netanyahu's concern for his political selfish survival far outweighs his concern for the survival of the hostages. Madam President, the resolution is also clear in rejecting any attempt at demographic or territorial change in the Gaza Strip, including any actions that reduce the territory of Gaza, a goal Israel continues to pursue as mass forcible displacement and annexation remain its primary aims throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. The resolution also reiterates the Council's unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions, and stresses the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. This is the only way forward. This is the only way forward. Sustaining the ceasefire, implementing it in full, and transforming it into a clear and immediate pathway to Palestinian independence and ceasefire for all. Act now. You can act not to allow the ceasefire to be broken, not to allow the starvation of the Palestinian people. Act now. Madam President, the State of Palestine and Arab countries, with the support of many around the world, have exerted every effort to ensure that Gaza in particular and Palestine as a whole are set on a different trajectory towards life and liberty, to change the reality our people has been for too long endured, and to change forever and for the better our region, for the benefit of all states and all peoples. A clear vision accompanied with a solid plan was endorsed by the Arab Summit and supported by the OIC ministerial meeting and has been welcomed worldwide. And many of you in your statement referred to your support to what was adopted in the Arab Summit conference. A small ray of hope was appearing on the dawn of the possibility of changing the tragedy in the Middle East to something that is different and promising. And perhaps that's why the criminal extremist leaders of Israel who do not want to allow this ray of possibility to flourish, they did what they did last night in order to destroy the efforts of all of us to open the door of peace. They are trying to close that door and to open the door of war and destruction and killing people. These efforts should be supported. The efforts of the Arabs, the OIC, and all of you that you've referred to should be supported, not compromised and sabotaged. They offer the only viable path away from conflict and towards peace. They have transformative power. Allow them to flourish. Allow them to become the new reality. Don't allow the other option of war and destruction and taking away lives, especially of children and women. Peace saves lives. War takes lives. Act. Choose peace. We, Palestine and Arab countries, are acting responsibly and with resolve to end this conflict once and for all. We are acting responsibly and with resolve to end this conflict once and for all. We will spare no effort, and we need all the help we can get. Help us. Act. We want peace. We have a plan. We have an alternative. We have options. It is crystal clear. Help us. Act with us to make peace is the option of the world, and make war not acceptable and need to be stopped, and ceasefire to prevail. This starts with supporting the Arab plan for reconstruction, which many of you refer to, supporting the Palestinian government's assumption of its responsibilities throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, the deployment of a UN-mandated mission throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, achieving a complete, comprehensive, and permanent ceasefire, and supporting an end of the occupation, Palestinian independence, implementing the two-state solution, and achieving shared peace and security. This is a historical moment where everyone must choose where they stand and what vision they want to see prevail. The next few days are decisive and can either set us on the right path or the wrong one, with huge implications for the region and the world. Help us in these few days to have the ceasefire in place, not the continuation of war. Life must prevail. Liberty must prevail. Peace must prevail. You are the mighty Security Council. Act, help us, and I thank you very much, Madam President.
And I thank the permanent observer. I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. We stand firm in our commitment to return the hostages and defeat Hamas. And it's time for the international community to take our commitment seriously. We will bring home every lost hostage. Hamas has refused to release our hostages and repeatedly rejected all the offers, both by the US and the mediating countries, even for the period of Ramadan. And thus, the return to fighting is a necessity. The IDF is attacking targets of the Hamas terrorist organization to achieve our objectives. These precise attacks include Hamas terrorist commanders, terrorist cells, launch posts, weapon stockpiles, and additional military infrastructure that are being used by these terrorist organizations to continue to plan and execute attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers. However, we are drawn into a discussion today not to alleviate suffering, not to seek truth, but to indulge the political agenda of certain members of this council. Those who wield humanitarian rhetoric and feign concern as a weapon, turning a blind eye to the primary cause of suffering in Gaza, the Hamas terrorist organization, which continues to hold 59 innocent hostages. For those truly concerned about humanitarian crises, there is one that should be paramount: the hostages still held in Hamas's brutal captivity. Men, women, children, the elderly, innocents ripped from their homes and subjected to horrors beyond comprehension. Many are already believed to be dead, while others continue to be tormented day after day. For over a year and 4 months, they have been deprived of sunlight, medical care, the comfort of their families' embrace. Their conditions are unknown, their treatment unimaginable. This is the most urgent humanitarian crisis, and yet those who claim to be the loudest voices for human rights have somehow lost their voices on this matter. So let us be clear: any discussion of humanitarian suffering that does not begin with the hostage release is not an honest discussion. For months, Israel took unprecedented steps to facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel's war is against Hamas, not Gaza's civilians. And yet, despite our efforts, Hamas refuses every opportunity for peace. It refuses to release the hostages. Over a 6-week period between January and February alone, Israel facilitated the entry of an unprecedented amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza, over 25,000 aid trucks, averaging more than 4,200 trucks per week. These trucks carried food, medical supplies, and essential goods. This is not speculation, not political rhetoric. This is in fact documented, verifiable, and confirmed by the organizations distributing and supplying the aid. In addition to the thousands of aid trucks, bakeries are operational across Gaza, producing millions of loaves of bread daily. In northern Gaza alone, increased fuel deliveries resulted in a 40% increase in bakery output. The slander that the people of Gaza are currently starving is quite simply untrue. Fuel and gas deliveries also continued over this period. Nearly 1,000 fuel tankers entered Gaza, including 275 to the north. Claims that the electricity cutoff has plunged Gaza into humanitarian collapse are greatly exaggerated, particularly regarding water infrastructure. Water pipes and sewage repair materials were sent to northern Gaza, ensuring that infrastructure remains functional. During the same 6-week period, over 840,000 tents were delivered. This was a massive logistical undertaking supported by international partners and facilitated by Israel. Madam President, let us be very clear. If there is suffering in Gaza, it is not because of a lack of aid. It is because Hamas has hijacked an entire civilian population for its own violent ends. Hamas diverts food, Hamas hoards fuel, Hamas transforms hospitals, schools, and UN facilities into command centers, ensuring that even in the presence of humanitarian aid, suffering persists. But somehow, in the debates of this council, Hamas is an afterthought, a footnote, a mere inconvenience in the preferred narrative. And so, instead of asking why Hamas continues to prolong this war, instead of asking why Hamas rejected a ceasefire extension that would have freed civilians from suffering, instead of asking why Hamas holds hostages in horrific conditions, instead of asking these questions, certain members choose instead to malign Israel, the only party in this conflict undertaking their humanitarian obligations and taking steps to meet them. Israel will not be lectured by those who exploit human suffering for political gain. If this council wishes to address suffering, then it must demand the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. There can be no progress until this occurs. There can be no relenting against the evil that we face. The massive amounts of humanitarian aid which Israel coordinated and facilitated, at least those amounts not seized by Hamas, have reached every segment of Gaza's population, with one tragic exception: the hostages. While Gazan civilians benefit from food, medicine, shelter, and support, these innocent individuals languish in conditions that defy human comprehension, a stark reminder of the vast moral inequivalence between Israel and Hamas. The release of the hostages is the first, the most urgent, the most fundamental step towards ending this war. The people of Gaza deserve a future free from Hamas and the pain that they wrought. The innocent Israelis wasting away in Hamas's tunnel network must once again feel the sun on their faces and embrace their loved ones. This is the only true path to peace. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Majid Abdulaziz, Permanent Observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank
يسعدني
you,
أن
Madam
ألقي هذا
President.
البيان اليوم
I'm
باسم
honored to
جامعة
make this
الدول
statement today
العربية
on behalf
ودولها
of the
الأعضاء
League of Arab States and its
ونستهله
member
بالإعراب
states.
عن التقدير
I would like to
لرئاستكم
begin by
المتميزة
expressing our
للمجلس
appreciation for your
ولاستجابتكم
excellent
لطلب المجموعة العربية والجامعة
stewardship of
العربية
the work of the
ودول
Council and for
أخرى
positively
عديدة
responding to the
لعقد
request
هذه
by the
الجلسة
Arab Group, the League of Arab
لتعزيز
States
العمل
and other
الدولي من
member
خلال
states
مجلس
to hold
الأمن
this meeting to
للتصدي
promote
لاستئناف
international work
إسرائيل
through the
لتصفيها
Council
العسكري
to
الوحشي
address
لقطاع غزة
Israel's resumption of
وللتدهور
its
المستمر
brutal
للوضع
military
الإنساني في
bombardment of
القطاع
Gaza and for the
نتيجة
continued deterioration
للقيود
of the
التي
humanitarian
فرضتها
situation
وتفرضها
in the Gaza Strip due
إسرائيل
to
على
the
إدخال المساعدات
continued
الإنسانية
restrictions by
في
Israel
استمرار
on
لسياسة
the
التجويع
entry of
والتعطيش
humanitarian assistance
المحرمة
in the
دوليا
continuation of the
وأن أعرب
policy
في نفس
of
الوقت عن كل
starvation and
التقدير
forced
لوكيل
search that
السكرتير
is
العام
internationally
للشؤون
prohibited. We would
الإنسانية
like
توم
to express
فليتشر
our appreciation
على
to
إحاطته
USG
الهامة
Fletcher for the important
واقتراحاته
briefing
البناءة.
and the constructive
سيدة الرئيسة،
suggestions.
سبق أن
Madam
أكدت
President,
القمة العربية
the
في
Arab
إعلان البحرين
Summit
في
in the
16 مايو
Bahrain declaration
2024
on the 16th of May
وعودت
2024
القمة
has
التأكيد
stressed,
في بيان
and
القاهرة
this has been
الصادر عن
reaffirmed in
القمة
the
العربية غير
Cairo
العادية التي
communique
عقدت
of
تحت
the
شعار قمة
extraordinary Arab Summit
فلسطين في
that was
4
held under the
مارس
slogan
2025
Palestine
على
Summit
إدانة
on the 4th of
سياسات
March
التجويع
2025.
والأرض
Both have
المحروقة
condemned
الهادفة لإجبار
policies of
الشعب
starvation and
الفلسطيني
scorched
على
earth
الرحيل من
tactics
أرضه.
aimed at forcing the Palestinian
وشددت
people
قمة
to leave their
القاهرة
land.
على
The
إدانة
Cairo
القرار
Summit
الصادر مؤخرا عن
condemned
الحكومة
the
الإسرائيلية
Israeli
بوقف
government's
إدخال
recent decision to
المساعدات
hold
الإنسانية
humanitarian aid to Gaza
لقطاع غزة
and
وغلق
close
المعابر
relief
المستخدمة في أعمال
crossings.
الإغاثة. كما قررت
The
القمة
summit
رفض
also decided
استخدام
to
إسرائيل
reject
لسلاح
Israel's
الحصار
use of
وتجويع المدنيين
blockade
لمحاولة تحقيق
as
أغراض سياسية.
a weapon
كما
and the
شددت
starvation
على
of
الأولوية
civilians as a
القصوى
means to achieve
لاستكمال
political gain.
تنفيذ
It
اتفاق
also
وقف
stressed
إطلاق
the
النار
utmost priority of the
لمرحلتيه
continuation of the
الثانية
implementation of the
والثالثة.
second and third phases
ويؤكد
of
كل ذلك
the
سيدة
ceasefire
الرئيسة
agreement.
على الرابطة
All
الجوهرية
this,
بين
Madam
التوصل
President,
للوقف
stresses
الكامل
the crucial
والشامل
link
لإطلاق
between
النار
the
وفقا
comprehensive and
للاتفاق
full
الذي تم التوصل إليه
ceasefire
بالوساطة الأمريكية
in accordance with the
المصرية
agreement
القطرية
based
والسماح
on
بدخول
the
المساعدات
US, Qatari,
الإنسانية
and
بدون
Egyptian
انقطاع
mediation and to
وبكثافة عالية
allow the entry of
والبدء
humanitarian
فورا في
assistance
تنفيذ
without
المرحلة
interruption and in big
الأولى من
volumes,
الخطة
as well as
التي
starting the
اقترحتها
implementation of the
جمهورية
first
مصر
phase
العربية
of the plan
بالتنسيق
proposed
الكامل مع
by
دولة فلسطين
Egypt in full
والدول
coordination with the
العربية
state of Palestine and Arab
واستنادا
states,
إلى
and
الدراسات
based on
التي أجريت
studies
من قبل
that
البنك
were
الدولي
conducted by the World
والصندوق
Bank
الإنمائي
and the
للأمم
UNDP
المتحدة بشأن
on
التعافي المبكر
early
وإعادة إعمار
recovery
قطاع
and the
غزة
reconstruction of the Gaza
واعتمدتها
Strip.
قمة
This
القاهرة
plan was
باعتبارها
adopted by
خطة
the Cairo
عربية
Summit as
جامعة
a pan-Arab
واعتمدها
plan,
الاجتماع
and it was
الوزاري
also adopted by the
لمنظمة
ministerial
المؤتمر
meeting of the
الإسلامي بعد ذلك.
OIC at a later point in
فبعد أن
time.
قتلت الحرب الإسرائيلية
The
على غزة
Israeli
والتي
war on
استمرت لأكثر
Gaza
من
of more
470
than
يوما
470
أكثر من
days have
48 ألف
killed
فلسطيني،
more than 48,000
منهم ما يقرب من
Palestinians,
18 ألفا من
including
الأطفال
18,000 children
و13 ألفا من
and
النساء،
13,000 women.
وخلفت تدميرا
And it
شبه كاملا
almost
للمنشآت
completely
الصحية
destroyed health
والتعليمية
and
والبنية
educational
التحتية
and
وكل
infrastructure
مقومات الحياة
facilities
في
and
غزة.
all necessities of
فلا
life in
شك أن
Gaza.
استئناف القصف
The
العسكري
resumption
الوحشي
of
المكثف
the brutal
لقطاع غزة
military intensive bombardment
واستشهاد أكثر
of the
من
Gaza Strip
400
and the
فلسطيني في
the
غزة
killing of more
أمس
than
فقط،
400 Gazans in
وتكثيف إسرائيل من
Gaza
تنفيذ سياسة
yesterday, and
التجويع
Israel's
والحصار على
intensification
قطاع
of the
غزة،
policy of
والتي
blockade and
تمثل
starvation
آخرها
on the
بقرار
Gaza
وزارة
Strip,
الطاقة
and the
الإسرائيلية
most
بقطع
recent of
التيار
which was the
الكهربائي
decision by the
على
Israeli
المنشآت
Ministry of
الحيوية
Power
بالقطاع،
to cut
بما في ذلك
the power
محطات تحلية
supply
المياه
to the vital
الرئيسية
sectors, including the
الذي
main
أضاف
desalination
التعطيش إلى
water
التجويع،
plant. This has added
ويفاقم
forced
من
thirst
معاناة
to
أكثر من
starvation.
مليوني
It
فلسطيني
aggravates the
يعيشون
suffering of
في
more than
ظروف
2 million
قاسية
Palestinians living
قاهرة.
in unbearable conditions.
كل هذه الهجمات
These
والإجراءات
attacks
اللا
and
إنسانية
measures
المدانة
are
والمرفوضة
inhumane,
لا
condemned,
يمكن
and
توصيفها
unacceptable.
إلا كعقاب
They
جماعي
are nothing but collective
تنتهجه
punishment
إسرائيل
by
بحق الشعب
Israel,
الفلسطيني
perpetrated by
الأعزل
Israel
وعلى
against
نحو
the
يتنافى
defenseless Palestinian
والقيم
people,
والمبادئ
which runs
الإنسانية
counter to
التي تقوم
humanitarian
عليها ومن
principles and
أجلها
values,
هذه المنظمة،
which constitute the very foundation
ويشكل
and mission of this
تحديا
organization.
للإرادة
This is a
الدولية
challenge to the
التي
international will
ساندت
that
وقف
has
إطلاق النار.
supported the ceasefire.
ومع تفاقم الأزمة على هذا
In
النحو
light of the
واستئناف
deterioration of
إسرائيل
this
لقصفها
crisis and
العسكري
Israel's
المكثف
resumption of
لقطاع
its
غزة أمس،
intensive military
تشدد المجموعة
bombardment in
العربية على
Gaza
حتمية
yesterday,
أن
the
ينهض
Arab group
مجلس الأمن
stresses that the
بمسؤولياته هذه
Council
المرة،
needs to shoulder its
وأن
responsibility
يجبر
this
المجلس
time and to
إسرائيل على
compel
الوفاء
Israel to
بالتزاماتها
honor its
بموجب
obligations
اتفاق وقف إطلاق
under the
النار،
ceasefire
بما في
agreement,
ذلك فتح
including
كافة
opening
المعابر
all
أمام المساعدات
crossings
الإنسانية
to
والإيوائية
humanitarian aid
والمستلزمات
and
الطبية
the
والوقود،
delivery of medical
وإعادة
and
التيار الكهربائي
fuel
للقطاع
items
بالكامل،
and shelter items, and to
بما
restore
في ذلك
electricity to the
محطات
entirety
المياه
of the strip,
وتلبية
including the
الاحتياجات
water plants,
الأساسية
and to
للسكان
meet the basic
والتخفيف
needs
من
of the people
معاناتهم.
and to alleviate their
وتحذر
suffering.
المجموعة
The group
من تبعات إخفاق
warns
المجلس
against
في اتخاذ هذه الإجراءات،
the council not
والتي
taking
ينذر
such
بخطر
measures,
وقوع كارثة
which ushers
إنسانية
in
كبرى
a catastrophic
لن تحمد
human
عقباها.
disaster with
كما
unpredictable
تؤكد
consequences.
المجموعة
The
والجامعة
Arab group
العربية على أن
and the
استمرار
League of
هذه
Arab
الأزمة
States
ومنع
stresses
أو
that the
عرقلة
continuation
وصول
of this crisis
هذه
and
المساعدات
obstruction of delivery of aid
يمثل انتهاكا
or
جسيما
preventing
لالتزامات
aid from
إسرائيل
getting
القوة
in
القائمة
is a
بالاحتلال
major and a
بموجب
grave
القانون
violation of
الدولي
Israel's
والقرارات الأممية وقواعد
obligations
حقوق
as the
الإنسان
occupying power
واتفاقية جنيف
under the
الرابعة
international law,
للعام
UN resolutions, and the
1949،
rules of human
لا
rights,
سيما
and the
الرأي
Fourth Geneva
الاستشاري الصادر
Convention
عن
of
محكمة العدل
1949
الدولية
and the
في
advisory
يوليو
opinion of the ICJ
2024 والإجراءات
issued in
المؤقتة
July
الصادرة
2024
عن
and the
محكمة
provisional
العدل
measures
الدولية
of the
وما
ICJ as
صدر من
well,
الجمعية
and
العامة
all the
ومجلس الأمن من قرارات
resolutions adopted
بناء
by the Security
عليها.
Council and the GA based
كما
on the
تؤكد
ICJ measures and
المجموعة
orders.
والجامعة
The
العربية على
group
ضرورة
and
تفعيل
the
مجلس الأمن
League stress
لآليات
that the
الرقابة
Council
الدولية
needs to
لضمان وصول
activate
المساعدات
international
بشكل
oversight
آمن
mechanisms
ومستدام
to
إلى جميع
guarantee the delivery
الفلسطينيين
of aid
المحتاجين،
safely and
وعلى
in a
ضرورة
sustainable manner
تعزيز
to all
الجهود الدولية
Palestinians in need.
لضمان
There needs to
حماية
be a promotion of
المدنيين
international efforts
الفلسطينيين
to ensure the
وتلبية
protection of the
احتياجاتهم
civilian
الأساسية
Palestinians and to meet
بشكل
their basic
فوري
needs
وفاعل.
immediately and
وتؤكد في
effectively.
هذا
We
الإطار
stress
على
in this
مركزية
regard
الدور
the central
الإنساني
humanitarian
الذي تطلع
role
به وكالة
of
الأونروا
UNRWA
في غزة
in Gaza,
والذي لا يمكن
which cannot be
استبداله بأي
replaced by
جهة
any
أخرى،
other entity.
وتشدد
We
على
stress
أهمية ضمان
the
استمرارها
importance of the
في
continued
تأدية
work of
خدماتها
UNRWA to provide
الحيوية
its vital services
للاجئين
to
الفلسطينيين
Palestine
وفق
refugees
تكليفها
according
الأممي.
to its UN mandate.
Excuse me. السيدة الرئيسة،
Madam
تشيد
President,
المجموعة
the
العربية
Arab
بالجهود
group
المضنية
commends
التي قادتها
the
مصر وقطر
tireless
والولايات
efforts
المتحدة
spearheaded
في
by
التوصل إلى
Qatar,
اتفاق
Egypt, and the
وقف
US
إطلاق النار في
to
غزة،
reach a
بما
ceasefire
في ذلك
agreement
إطلاق
in Gaza,
سراح الرهائن
including the
والمحتجزين،
release of detainees and hostages.
وتؤكد على
We stress
ضرورة
the
ممارسة
need
مجلس الأمن
for
أقصى
the
الضغط
Council
على
to
إسرائيل
exercise utmost pressure on
لوقف
Israel
عدوانها
to
العسكري
end its
الذي
military aggression
استأنفته
that was
بالأمس
resumed
ولاستكمال
yesterday,
تنفيذ
and to
اتفاق وقف
complete the
إطلاق النار
implementation of
بما
the
يشمل
ceasefire agreement,
مرحلتيه
including
الثانية
the second and
والثالثة
third phases
وجميع بنوده.
and all its elements.
الأخرى،
This,
وبما يؤدي إلى
this would
التوصل إلى
lead
الوقف
to
الدائم
reaching
للعدوان
a
على غزة
permanent
وانسحاب
end of
إسرائيل
the
كليا من القطاع
aggression on Gaza
وتيسير
and
عودة
Israel's
أهالي
full
غزة إلى
withdrawal from
مناطق
the strip,
سكنهم
and to
بما في ذلك
facilitate the
شمال
return of
القطاع
Gazans to
تماشيا
the
مع
areas of
قرارات
residence,
مجلس الأمن
including in the
وأبرزها
north, in
القرار
line with Security Council resolutions,
2735.
most notably Resolution 2725.
وتؤكد المجموعة والجامعة
The group and
على
the league
أهمية
stress
البناء على
the
هذه
need to
الجهود
build
من
on
أجل
those
الشروع في
efforts
تنفيذ
to
الخطة
begin the
العربية
implementation of the
للتعافي
Arab
المبكر
Early
وإعادة
Recovery
إعمار
and
غزة،
Reconstruction Plan.
كما نثني على
We
جهود مصر
commend
ودولة
the efforts
فلسطين
of
في
Egypt and
التحضير
the state of Palestine
لعقد مؤتمر
to prepare
دولي
for
حول
international
إعادة
conference
الإعمار
on
بالتعاون مع
reconstruction
الأمم
in
المتحدة
cooperation with the
والذي
UN,
ستستضيفه
which will
القاهرة
be
في
hosted by
المستقبل القريب.
Cairo
ونحث
very
الشركاء
soon.
في المجتمع
And we
الدولي
urge our
والمؤسسات المالية
international
الدولية
community
على
partners
توفير
and
كل الدعم
IFIs to
السياسي
provide
والمالي
all
لضمان
financial
تنفيذ
and
هذه
political
الخطة
support
الطموحة
to ensure
وبالأيادي
the implementation
الفلسطينية
of this
بغية إعادة
ambitious
تأهيل
plan
القطاع
by
وإعماره
Palestinian
بالسرعة
lands
المنشودة.
towards the
كما
rehabilitation
نشدد
and
معا على
reconstruction of
أهمية
the
تزامن
strip
تنفيذ هذه
at the
الخطة
desired pace.
مع
We
إطلاق
stress the
جهد
importance
دولي
that
فاعل
this
يهدف إلى
plan
تحقيق
would
السلام الدائم
coincide with
بما
international
يحفظ
effort
الحقوق الكاملة
towards
للشعب
sustainable
الفلسطيني
peace
ويحقق
and lasting
تطلعاته
peace to
المشروعة
protect the rights
لإقامة
of the
دولتهم
Palestinian people
المستقلة
and to achieve their
وانضمامها
aspirations in
كعضو
freedom and
كامل
statehood
بالأمم المتحدة بما في ذلك السعي
and
الدولي
joining the UN
لإنجاح
as a
المؤتمر
full-fledged member
الدولي
and
الذي
the
سيعقد بالأمم
effort to make
المتحدة في
the
يونيو
international conference that will be
2025
held in June
تحت
25,
الرئاسة السعودية
2025
الفرنسية
under the
ضمن جهود
French-Saudi
مبادرة حل
presidency is
الدولتين
success as
التي
part
تلقى
of the
دعما
two-state
دوليا
initiative
متزايدا
effort
كل
that
يوم.
is
ختاما
receiving
السيدة
mounting
الرئيسة
international support
تجدد
every
المجموعة
day.
العربية وجامعة الدول العربية
In
التأكيد
closing,
على
the
تضامنها الكامل
Arab
مع
group and
الشعب
the League of Arab
الفلسطيني
States
وعلى
reaffirms their
دعمها
full
القوي
solidarity with the
لصموده
Palestinian
التاريخي
people and their
على
strong
أرضه
support to its
وتمسكه
historic
بها
steadfastness of
ورفضه
its land
التغيير منها
as it
وتؤكد على أن
adheres to
استمرار
its land
العمليات
and
العسكرية
refuses to be forcibly
والحصار
displaced. We
والتجويع
stress that continued
والتعطيش
military operations,
والإجراءات القمعية
siege,
التي
starvation,
تقترفها
forced
إسرائيل
thirst, oppressive
لن
measures
يؤدي إلا إلى
perpetrated by
مزيد من
Israel will
التدهور في
only lead
الأوضاع
to further
الإنسانية
deterioration of the
والأمنية
humanitarian and
مما
security
يهدد
situation,
أمن المنطقة
threatening the
بأسرها.
security of the entire region.
ونجدد
We
تأكيدنا
reiterate
على أن الحل
that the
الوحيد
only
لهذا
solution
الصراع
to this conflict
يكمن في إنهاء
is by
الاحتلال
ending the
الإسرائيلي
Israeli occupation,
وضمان حق الشعب
guaranteeing the rights
الفلسطيني
of the
في تقرير
Palestinian people to
المصير
self-determination
وإقامته
and
لدولته
establishment
المستقلة
of their
ذات
independent
السيادة
sovereign state
وعاصمتها
with
القدس
East
الشرقية
Jerusalem
على
as its
أساس
capital
حل
on the basis
الدولتين
of the two-state
ومبادرة
solution
السلام
and the Arab
العربية
peace initiative
وانضمام دولة
and
فلسطين
the state of
كعضو
Palestine
كامل
joining as a
العضوية في
full-fledged
الأمم
member of
المتحدة.
the United Nations. I
شكرا
thank you,
سيدتي الرئيس.
Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abdulaziz for the statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I couldn't help but notice that some of the behavior during this meeting, including departing from the chamber and leaving a seat vacant while the representative of Israel was speaking under Rule 37, is inconsistent with the decorum that we expect in this chamber. And I just wanted to register that. I thank you.
And I thank the United States, the representative of the United States, for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Madam President, and I welcome the opportunity to update the Security Council on the humanitarian crisis. Overnight, our worst fears materialized. Airstrikes resumed across the entire Gaza Strip. Unconfirmed reports of hundreds of people killed. New evacuation orders issued by Israeli forces, and once again, the people of Gaza living in abject fear. Modest gains made during the ceasefire destroyed. Humanitarian workers remain on the ground. I'm in close touch with them, ready to provide life-saving support to survivors and carry out our humanitarian mission. We must be allowed to do so. Last month, Madam President, I visited the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel to meet survivors, frontline workers, and authorities. In Israel, I met with survivors of the horrendous Hamas-led attacks on 7th of October at the Nir Oz kibbutz. I will never forget my visit there. 1 in 4 people killed or taken hostage. In the West Bank, I met with families whose homes were demolished and who faced daily threats of eviction and forcible displacement. And yet, compared to now, my trip coincided with some of Gaza's better recent days. A ceasefire was in place. Humanitarians were delivering hundreds of trucks every day, saving lives and restoring hope. We demonstrated that when we are allowed to do so, we can deliver aid at scale. Not anymore. Today, I'm distressed to report that in addition to the intense airstrikes that have resumed, since the 2nd of March, Israeli authorities have cut off the entry of all life-saving supplies, food, medicines, fuel, cooking gas, for 2.1 million people. Our repeated requests to collect aid sitting at Kerem Shalom crossing have been systematically rejected. Food is rotting and medicines are expiring. No further hostages have been released. Only medical evacuations and humanitarian staff rotations have continued. And even those came to a halt today. During the ceasefire, we surged support after more than a year of aid being placed on a drip feed. The suspension of aid and commercial materials is reversing that progress that we achieved during that brief period. Essential survival resources needed are now being rationed. Israel has cut power to southern Gaza's desalination plant, limiting access to clean water for 600,000 people. The price of staples have surged. Vegetable prices in North Gaza have tripled. 6 bakeries subsidized by the World Food Programme have closed due to shortages of cooking gas. The World Health Organization warns that public health risks remain very high, including for communicable diseases, from overcrowding and poor sanitation. This total blockade of life-saving aid, basic commodities, and commercial goods will have a disastrous impact on the people of Gaza, who remain dependent on the steady flow of assistance into the Strip. Madam President, as Gaza is cut off again, our ability to deliver assistance and basic services is becoming harder. Funding levels for the response are extremely low. We're seeing increasing restrictions being placed on NGO partners who are critical to the aid operation, not only in Gaza, but across the OPT. Since the Knesset legislation formally took effect on the 30th of January 2025, UNRWA international staff are no longer able to rotate in and out of Gaza. The amount of cash that humanitarian personnel can bring into Gaza has been further decreased to a half of previous levels, far below what is required to cover even basic expenses for a 6-week rotation. On the 9th of March, Israeli authorities introduced new registration rules for international NGOs delivering humanitarian aid to Palestinians in the OPT. If enforced, these would impose strict conditions and significantly disrupt aid operations. The Israeli Knesset is also considering a bill to impose considerable taxation on donations from third states to Israeli NGOs, including humanitarian and human rights groups. If implemented, this would further erode the number of partners with the capacity to implement protection interventions. Many Israeli NGOs are engaged on legal cases involving home demolitions and forced evictions. They also provide protective presence activities related to settler violence. We continue to give what remains inside Gaza to those most in need. We are trucking water where we can, providing reduced food rations, and distributing shelter items. We continue to support hospitals with supplies, emergency medical teams, and casualty evacuations to hospitals in Gaza. Our education partners report that about 631 temporary learning spaces are now operational throughout Gaza, supporting over 172,000 students. But we cannot sustain this for much longer unless the crossings are opened again for aid to enter. Madam President, the 42-day ceasefire proved what was possible. Aid delivery was enabled, and we scaled up quickly and effectively. 30 hostages and 8 deceased hostages and 583 Palestinian detainees were released during that period. Criminal activity in Gaza was brought under control, reducing the looting of humanitarian convoys by armed Palestinians. Over 4,000 trucks of aid per week entered Gaza. We reached over 2 million people, 540 water delivery points set up, 113,000 tents distributed to families by the UN humanitarian partners and others. Our polio vaccination targets were exceeded, reaching over 600,000 children. Maternity kits were expanded to support 5,000 births. Thousands of postpartum kits were distributed for mothers and newborns. It proves what's possible when we're allowed to do our job. We cannot and must not accept a return to pre-ceasefire conditions or the complete denial of humanitarian relief. Civilians must be protected. Their essential needs must be met. International law must be respected. Madam President, I also have grave concerns about the protection of civilians in the West Bank. The situation there is an urgent crisis that must be addressed with the necessary international attention. Since the start of this year, 95 Palestinians have been killed, including 17 children, and 869 have been injured, including 179 children. The Israeli military has renewed wide-scale operations in the northern West Bank, deploying tanks for the first time in 2 decades. 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced in these operations, including from refugee camps and cities. Civilian infrastructure has been extensively destroyed. In Area C, Palestinian communities continue to be coerced off their land by settlement expansion, settler violence, and home demolitions. Hundreds of Israeli settlers have launched large-scale attacks on Palestinian villages, burning homes and destroying property. Over 800 movement obstacles, including over 20 new road gates and checkpoint closures, are severely disrupting Palestinians' access to work, healthcare, and essential services. Restrictions by Israeli authorities continue to prevent thousands of Palestinian worshippers from reaching holy sites. Madam President, 3 things need to happen right now. First and foremost, humanitarian aid and commercial essentials must be allowed to enter Gaza. Blocking food, water, medicine for people who need them is unconscionable. It also goes against international humanitarian law and the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice. Second, we must renew the ceasefire. Over 48,000 Palestinians have been killed and thousands more are missing. Over 1,200 Israelis have been killed. Over 100,000 Palestinians are injured, many with life-changing wounds. The return to hostilities overnight must cease. The suffering of the people of the region must end. A renewed ceasefire is the best way of protecting civilians in Gaza, in the OPT, and in Israel, releasing hostages and detainees, and allowing aid and commercial supplies in. And third, the humanitarian response must be funded. we have received only 4% of what is needed. We don't even have enough to get through this quarter. In closing, I'm reminded of a message I saw scrawled on a hospital whiteboard in Gaza, written by a doctor who was later killed. A message that has stuck with me. Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Remember us. Madam President, colleagues on the Security Council, will we be able to say that we did what we could? Thank you.
And I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Mr. Tom Fletcher for his sobering and alarming briefing. Algeria requested this meeting to address the blockade on Gaza, but recent development have made it more urgent and necessary as we witness another chapter of collective punishment being inflicted upon the people of Gaza. This is not a routine briefing on the ongoing suffering enduring by the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. This is not simply an account of deprivation. It is a plea for justice against an Israeli occupying authority that has weaponized starvation as a tool of war. This is, without a doubt, a war crime. The time has come for accountability. No one is above the law. Today, the world can no longer ignore the grim reality of the Israeli occupation. Today, the truth about the Israeli occupation overload for so long can no longer be hidden. As Algerians, we know, we understand the cruelty and the oppression of the occupation because we have enduring it for over 130 years. Occupation, the most horrible, the most shameful chapter in modern history, continues to wreak havoc, and it must be ended wherever it exists. Madam President, for now over 2 weeks, not a single aid truck have been allowed to enter Gaza. Not one. This deliberate blockade, timed to coincide with the holy month of Ramadan, is a calculated effort to break the resilience of the Palestinian people. With nearly 18 months of hunger already endured, 80% of Gaza's population has seen their sources of food vanished. Yet, as if starving people weren't enough, the Israeli occupying power is using water, yes, water, as a weapon of war. UNICEF reports that only 1 of 10 people in Gaza have access to clean water. And Israel has also taken the step of cutting off Gaza's electricity supply. The result? The sole desalination plant in Gaza is about to shut down, leaving an already weakened population without clean water. Without clean water. Are we really going to wait until more lives succumb to hunger and to epidemic? Madam President, this is not just about withholding aid. The Israeli occupation has targeted the entire Gaza's food system, making it impossible for the people to feed themselves today and very difficult to sustain themselves in the future. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Mr. Michael Fakhri, Israel is not merely obstructing aid. It is methodically dismantling Gaza's food infrastructure. Moreover, after attacking UNRWA, the backbone of Gaza's humanitarian aid, Israel, as an occupying power, has imposed new restrictions on all NGOs, thus creating new administrative obstacles to their ability to operate and assist the Palestinian people. The Palestinian NGO network has rightfully condemned this move, calling it a deliberate attempt to silence international aid organizations and isolate Palestinian voices from the global community. Amidst this humanitarian catastrophe, the Israeli occupying forces brazenly took the liberty of killing Palestinians, completely disregarding the ceasefire agreement. Just this night, just last night, the Israeli forces have launched a series of indiscriminate airstrikes across Gaza, resulting in the death of more 400 people, the majority of them women and children. Once again, Palestinian blood is being used as a tool for the political calculations of the Israeli politicians. We condemn firmly these attacks, which constitute a violation of the ceasefire agreement reached 2 months ago. And we remind all parties that Resolution 2735 guarantees the continuation of the ceasefire as long as negotiations are ongoing. We also emphasize the responsibility of the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, in ensuring compliance with the ceasefire agreement. Madam President, the International Court of Justice has already spoken on this matter. In its provisional measures, the ICJ has ordered Israel as the occupying power to immediately take all necessary actions to ensure the unimpeded delivery of urgent humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. This includes the provision of basic services such as food, water, electricity, fuel, medical care, and sanitation. This very council, in its resolutions, has called for safe and unhindered humanitarian access. Yet, the Israeli occupying power continue not only to ignore international law, including the resolutions adopted by this council, but to kill indiscriminately innocent Palestinian civilians. Madam President, we wonder what those who consistently invoke a so-called Israel's right to self-defense will say in response to this cruelty, to these atrocities. In Gaza, we are witnessing the systematic degradation of human dignity, the deliberate stripping away of the right of life, the right to life, to food, to water, and to basic human dignity. In Gaza, we are witnessing the demise of the values and principles that should be the foundation of international order: equality, humanity, justice. In Gaza, we are witnessing a cowardice and brutality of the Israeli occupation that is in full display, with no regard for innocent lives. Still silent, faced to these atrocities, the relevance of this council is seriously questioned. Will it ever dare to take responsibility? Will it ever act to stop this genocide and preserve what remains, if any, of its credibility? I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to begin by thanking USG Fletcher for his sovereign briefings and on the latest development in Gaza. The scale of destruction and loss of life demands our immediate attention and action. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza has reached unprecedented level of severity. We express our profound concern about the inconceivable decisions on March 2nd to halt humanitarian aid in Gaza by Israel to a territory where over 2 million people, including 1 million children, are desperately struggling to survive. The suspension of humanitarian operation at a time when humanitarian needs are at their most critical threatens to completely unravel the already fragile humanitarian response. UNRWA's role is irreplaceable, and its services are indispensable for the survival of millions of Palestinians. We categorically reject Israel's use of starvation as weapons and any humanitarian attempt to use humanitarian aid as bargaining chip in ceasefire negotiations. This represents continuation of grave breach of international law and instrumentalization of humanitarian aid. As the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, rightly stated, humanitarian aid is not negotiable. It must flow without impediment as required by the international law and basic human dignity. Israel, as occupying power, has the obligation under the international law to ensure civilian access essential goods services, including humanitarian assistance. We express our strongest condemnation of today's Israeli airstrike in Gaza that has claimed more than 400 innocent people, marking one of the deadliest days since the conflict began. Such indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations are not only morally indefensible, but constitutes serious violation of international humanitarian law. This dangerous escalation threatens to plunge the region back into full-scale war at a time when humanitarian needs are most acute. We must address the escalating violence in the West Bank, where IDF operations have intensified dramatically, resulting in the numerous Palestinian casualties, including women and children. Additionally, the illegal expansion of settlement, demolition of homes, and systematic violence against Palestinian civilians represent a dangerous pattern of aggression that threatens to further destabilize the region. A definitive ceasefire now is the first step to ensure the population, including women and children, are protected from further physical and psychological harm. In that vein, we underscore the paramount priority of fully implementing the ceasefire agreement in its second and third phases, while ensuring all parties, in particular Israel, honors its commitment in a manner consistent with international law obligations. On the occasion of the holy month of Ramadan, we call for the de-escalation across the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as an access for worshippers to blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque to free and safely perform their religious rituals in full preservation of the legal and historic status quo of the holy site in the occupied Jerusalem. The pursuit of just and a comprehensive peace remains our strategic imperative. In that regard, the end of the occupation and full recognition of a free, sovereign, independent Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with the relevant resolutions remains the only sustainable option for the resolutions on this long-standing conflict. The international community must stand against any attempt to alter the demographic composition of forcibly displaced Palestinians from their camps and cities or annex any part of the West Bank or Gaza under any pretext. Such actions will constitute grave violations of international law and amount to ethnic cleansing. Madam President, as we deliberate in this chamber, people of Gaza, in particular children and women, are counting the hours until their next meal, if it comes at all. Mothers are rationing drops of water among their families while bombs are being dropped on their shelters. Medical workers are performing surgeries by using mobile phone lights. This is not just a crisis of resource, it's a crisis of our collective conscience. Let our decisions today reflect our humanity. It's our moral imperative to protect innocent lives and pursue justice and lasting peace in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this meeting of the United Nations Security Council has been called to address the worsening humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip following the humanitarian blockade imposed by the government of the State of Israel. With the devastating bombing across Gaza in the past 24 hours, it is evident that this meeting is being held when there is a direct violation of the ceasefire. Let me thank Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher, for his important and sobering briefing. Sierra Leone acknowledges the continued leadership of United Nations and the dedication of all humanitarian entities and personnel in responding to the dire humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. The ceasefire agreement reached by the government of Israel and Hamas in January 2025 was a significant development, demonstrating the potential of good faith engagement and political will in achieving tangible progress. However, while the agreement reduced violence, its implementation has been marred by severe challenges that demanded urgent redress and continued engagement. Madam President, colleagues, most critically, for over 2 weeks, the government of Israel completely suspended the entry of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies into the Gaza Strip. The consequences of this blockade have been devastating, deepening the suffering of civilians and exacerbating an already dire humanitarian crisis. The deliberate withholding of food, water, medical supplies, and electricity, particularly when imposed on a besieged population already facing extreme hardship, constitute, in our view, collective punishment, a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Since March 2nd, humanitarian aid has been completely blocked from entering Gaza, leaving 1.9 million displaced persons without food, medical care, or other life-sustaining assistance. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency, UNRWA, and other humanitarian organizations have reported massive shortage of food, medicine, and medical supplies, further exacerbating the dire conditions in overcrowded shelters and hospitals. Of particular concern are reports from UNFPA and UNICEF regarding the prolonged denial of reproductive health services for women and girls, further violating their rights to health and dignity. The cutting off of electricity has worsened the crisis, rendering hospitals and health facilities unable to operate critical life-saving equipment. The collapse of the main desalination and purification plant has deprived thousands of families, including children, of access to clean drinking water, exacerbating risk of waterborne diseases and severe malnutrition. Under international law, the State of Israel, as the occupying power, has clear obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention, requiring it to ensure the provision of food and medical supplies to the civilian population, to maintain medical and hospital services, and to allow and facilitate humanitarian relief operations and their rapid distribution. The deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid in Gaza is a serious violation of these obligations. Additionally, Sierra Leone recalls the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in 2024 in the South Africa versus Israel case, which specifically required the government of Israel to take immediate steps to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access into Gaza. The continued blockade defies the court's binding ruling and further endangers the civilian population. It appears there is a manifest pattern of conduct directed at the Palestinian people that should cause this council to sound the alarm, as others have done. The airstrikes by the Israel Defense Forces in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza, reported to have killed 8 workers and journalists 3 days ago, raised grave concerns about the potential resurgence of hostilities after the ceasefire respite, increasing the risk of regional escalation and reversing the fragile gains made since the ceasefire. It has been further reported that overnight, the IDF carried out extensive strikes in the Gaza Strip, with more than 400 Palestinians reported to have been killed. Are these actions not a deliberate infliction of condition of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the Palestinian people? The collective punishment, indiscriminate killings, and withholding of food, water, and medical supplies essential for survival? Like a canary in the coal mine, we must sound the alarm. The intentional deprivation of humanitarian aid, when combined with the scale of suffering, displacement, and reported rhetoric from high-ranking officials advocating for such measures, raising serious concerns. This Council and the international community has a duty to act and to fulfill its obligations. Sierra Leone calls on the Security Council to take urgent action to ensure the immediate and full resumption of humanitarian aid to Gaza and to uphold international humanitarian law. We stress the importance of first, reaffirming that the State of Israel, as the occupying power, must comply with its obligation under the 4th Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. Second, ensuring full compliance with the ICJ's provisional measures which demand unimpeded humanitarian access. Third, supporting the protection of humanitarian workers who continue to risk their lives to deliver essential services under severe restrictions. UNRWA, UNICEF, and WHO remain critical actors in sustaining the fragile healthcare system and addressing the needs of premature newborns, young children, and elderly patients vulnerable to diseases. As USG Tom Fletcher said, we must return to the ceasefire. Madam President, Sierra Leone condemned at the first occasion the brutal acts of terror committed by Hamas and other armed groups against Israeli civilians on 7th October 2023. We affirm the prohibition of hostage-taking under international law and demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas since 7th October 2023. We are clear and unequivocal on this point, while noting and respecting the agreed arrangement for the release of Palestinian detainees endorsed by this Council. We therefore emphasize the necessity of sustained diplomatic engagement to consolidate the ceasefire agreement and address outstanding issues. A just and lasting solution to this crisis requires the full and immediate restoration of humanitarian aid access, respect for international law and accountability, the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and a political resolution based on the two-state solution, ensuring security and coexistence for both Israeli and Palestinians. This Council must remain steadfast in upholding its responsibility to maintain peace, security, and justice. The cost of inaction is too high, and the suffering of the people in Gaza, the occupied Palestinian territory, and Israel cannot and must not be ignored. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, thank you for organizing today's briefing, and my thanks as well to USG Fletcher for his sobering briefing. Madam President, Palestinians are observing another Ramadan marked by deprivation and renewed destruction. More than 400 of them were reportedly killed in the last 24 hours. It is ironic that in this holy month of when Muslims across the world seek to grow in moral probity, Palestinians are confronted with more suffering brought about by an apparent paucity of humanity and compassion. The past 3 weeks have seen a rollback of the humanitarian progress made over the previous 6 weeks, following the ceasefire deal brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. With the pause of the Israeli offensive in Gaza and the easing of several restrictions on humanitarian assistance, Palestinians, and indeed the international community, were hopeful that the situation would progressively improve, culminating at some point in a full recovery for Gaza. Guyana is therefore very disappointed that a decision was taken to halt humanitarian aid into Gaza since March 2nd on account of a deadlock in the negotiations between Israel and Hamas. This decision is illegal since Israel is obligated under international law not to deprive civilians of the goods and services essential for their survival. Guyana is further disappointed that Palestinian civilians are again being made to walk the path of war, which has ravaged their lives and their land for over 15 months. Guyana calls on this council to take the necessary action to prevent a repeat of the catastrophe which Gaza has endured for more than a year. Coupled with this new offensive, the ongoing aid blockade has placed Palestinians in an extremely precarious situation, as we have heard from USG Fletcher. Guyana calls on Israel to lift the ban on the entry of aid into Gaza, in keeping with its obligations under international humanitarian law. As asserted by the World Food Programme, and I quote, unimpeded humanitarian access is the only means of survival for many families, unquote. We therefore call for full respect for their right to life. We further call on Israel and Hamas to prioritize the lives and well-being of civilians and to urgently reach agreement on the next phase of the ceasefire deal and ultimately on a permanent ceasefire. We also call on Israel to halt airstrikes on Gaza, as these only strain the negotiating environment in addition to bringing more death and destruction. Madam President, as the largest gathering on women's empowerment and gender equality, the Commission on the Status of Women is currently meeting in New York. Allow me to speak on the pained reports of the situation of women and girls in Palestine, both in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. We have taken note of the 13th March report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, on Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence since 7th October 2023. The report has elaborated the disproportionate impact of the war on Palestinian women and girls, who continue to bear the brunt of the decisions taken by those in power. Civilian women and girls have been reportedly targeted directly. Women have died from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth because of restrictions imposed and conditions created by the war. Their access to adequate health care, including reproductive health care, have been severely curtailed. The combination of starvation, denial of humanitarian assistance, destruction of Gaza's healthcare system, and lack of access to water and sanitation has caused severe reproductive harms to women, impacting all aspects of reproduction, including pregnancy, childbirth, postpartum recovery, and lactation. Further, women and girls are enduring conditions that severely limit their ability to manage postpartum bleeding and menstruation hygienically and with dignity. The mantra of no one left behind rings hollow when Palestinian women and girls see their rights trampled upon daily, and the very basic of necessities for female hygiene, which many of us take for granted, such as sanitary napkins and water, become a luxury. Madam President, one of the most painful realizations is all of this is happening in the 21st century. With all the international legal advances made for the protection and promotion of the rights of women and girls, the situation in Palestine should never have reached these proportions. The situation of children is equally distressing, Madam President. As reported by UNICEF, without aid entering the Gaza Strip, roughly 1 million children are again living without the very basics they need to survive. Madam President, dear colleagues, the people in Gaza continue to suffer because of political decisions that they had no part in making. These decisions will be felt for years, even decades, by innocent people who will still be grappling with the socioeconomic, physical, and psychological impacts of this war long after the guns have gone silent. In fact, this is a double tragedy, since the people of Israel will also continue to grapple with the consequences of a decades-old war that keeps pitting them against people who, just like themselves, dream of peace. Guyana's singular appeal to the parties is to prioritize peace for the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. In so doing, we reiterate the need for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire to create the conditions for the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. Guyana again calls on Israel to lift its illegal blockade of aid into the Gaza Strip to facilitate the easing of the dire humanitarian situation, and on the international community to scale up its humanitarian assistance. We also reiterate the demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages from Gaza and of Palestinian prisoners detained in Israeli jails without charge. Finally, Guyana calls for earnest efforts towards a lasting, just, and comprehensive peace between Israel and Palestine, premised on the two-state solution. Guyana remains committed to doing its part to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. Before I give the floor to the representative of France, I would like to announce our, I'm sorry, I'm wrong here. So I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Undersecretary General Coordinator Fletcher, for your briefing. Madam President, colleagues, the blame for the resumption of hostilities lies solely with Hamas. This brutal terrorist organization has steadfastly refused every proposal and deadline they've been presented over the past few weeks, including a bridge proposal to extend the ceasefire beyond Ramadan and Passover, to allow time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. Hamas refused this offer, preferring still to hold hostages captive and hide amongst the people of Gaza, using them as human shields. It is the people of Gaza who will suffer further because of Hamas's disregard for human life. Madam President, in this context, I want to respond to the allegation of indiscriminate attacks by the IDF. The IDF is striking Hamas positions. It is well known that Hamas continues to use civilian infrastructure as launching pads, and the United States condemns this practice, as should others. President Trump has made clear that Hamas must release the hostages immediately or pay a high price, and we support Israel in its next steps. Hamas must release the hostages it abducted more than 17 months ago. Doing so would enable loved ones to be reunited and allow the return of remains for those killed while being held by Hamas. Unfortunately, Hamas has refused all attempts to find a way to extend the ceasefire. It has been weeks since Hamas has released any hostages. We must recognize Hamas's savagery for what it is. This terrorist organization committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, raped and engaged in sexual violence toward Israeli hostages and other victims of the attack, released multiple hostages in a condition reminiscent of Holocaust survivors, and murdered and then paraded the coffins of the Bibas children through the streets. President Trump has been clear. All of the remaining 59 hostages, including New Jersey resident Idan Alexander and the bodies of 4 Americans murdered by Hamas, Itai Chen, Gadi Hagai, Judy Weinstein Hagai, and Omer Nutra, must be immediately released. Behind every terrorist group like Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, behind every act of violence, behind everything that threatens peace and stability for the millions of people who call this region home, is Iran. The countries of the Middle East have an historic opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords all its people a better path forward. Stronger ties between Israel and its neighbors offer an alternative to Iran's malign influence and state sponsorship of terror. The United States will do its part with our Arab partners to work toward a durable solution to the conflict and create a more prosperous future for the region's people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I will now try again to welcome our new colleague, Ambassador Jérôme Bonafont, who's the new permanent representative of France to the Security Council. We look forward to working together. You have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et
Thank
merci
you,
pour vos mots
Madam
d'accueil et de
President,
bienvenue.
and thank you for your words
J'essaierai
of
d'être à la
welcome.
hauteur de mon
I'll
prédécesseur Nicolas
Try to
Rivière,
be as
qui
good
m'a dit à quel
as
point
Nicolas
il
de Rivière, my
appréciait ses
predecessor.
relations de travail et
He
de
told me that
coopération
he very much
avec
appreciated
toutes et tous
his
les membres de ce Conseil.
work in the council and
Madame
the
la Présidente, la
cooperation with
France
members.
remercie le coordonnateur des
We
secours
would like to thank
d'urgence
the
pour son
coordinator
exposé
for
et elle
his
remercie
briefing,
l'ensemble des personnels
and we'd
humanitaires
like to thank
déployés
all
au
humanitarian
secours des
actors
populations
working
affectées
to
par la
help the
crise humanitaire.
population affected by the
Madame la
humanitarian
Présidente,
situation.
Tom Fletcher l'a dit,
Madam
la
President, Tom Fletcher said
situation
this, the
humanitaire dans la
humanitarian
bande de
situation in
Gaza
the Gaza
est
Strip,
redevenue
it has
catastrophique.
once again become
Il n'y a rien
disastrous.
à ajouter à sa
Nothing can be
description.
added to
Nous
this
espérions ne
description.
plus avoir à le redire.
We hope
Et
that we won't
pourtant,
have
la
to say
réalité
this
nous
again,
oblige.
or we hope that,
La
but
France
reality
condamne
now means
les
that we
frappes
have to.
israéliennes menées
France
depuis
condemns
hier
the
sur la bande de
Israeli
Gaza,
strikes carried out
qui ont fait
yesterday in the
déjà
Gaza
plusieurs
Strip
centaines
that
de
have
morts
already
et de
led
blessés.
to hundreds of civilian victims.
Elle appelle à un arrêt
We
immédiat des
call for an
hostilités qui
immediate
compromettent les
end
efforts
to
de libération des
hostilities, which
otages
compromises the
et
efforts to
menace la vie
release
des
the
populations
hostages
civiles
and
de
threatens
Gaza.
the lives of the civilian
Toutes les
population in
parties
Gaza. All
doivent revenir au
parties
respect du
must
cessez-le-feu dans
respect
son
the
intégralité
ceasefire
et s'engager dans des négociations de bonne
comprehensively
foi
and engage in
afin
good
de le
faith
pérenniser
negotiations in order to
et
make the
poursuivre
ceasefire
sur la voie ouverte
permanent
par l'accord de janvier.
and
La France
continue with the
appelle les
January
autorités
agreement. We call
israéliennes
upon the
à
Israeli
assurer la
authorities to
protection
ensure
permanente
the
de tous les
permanent
civils,
protection of all civilians
à rétablir
and
l'accès
to
à l'eau et à
re-establish
l'électricité,
access to
ainsi qu'à
water
lever
and
immédiatement les
electricity, as well
obstacles
as to
à
immediately
l'entrée de l'aide
lift
humanitaire à
obstacles to
Gaza.
the entry of
Elle
humanitarian aid in
réitère son
Gaza.
appel à la
We
libération
reiterate our
inconditionnelle de
call for
tous les
the
otages
unconditional
encore
release of all
détenus à
hostages
Gaza.
still detained in Gaza.
La France exprime aussi sa
France also
préoccupation
expresses its
s'agissant
concern
de la
with regard
situation
to
faite aux
the
populations civiles en
situation
Cisjordanie
for the
et en particulier en
civilians
matière
in
de
the
déplacement
West
forcé.
Bank, particularly forced
Elle appelle les autorités
displacement. We call
israéliennes à
upon the
faire
Israeli
preuve de la
authorities
plus grande retenue dans
to
l'usage de la
show the
force
greatest
et
restraint
à
in the use of
assurer,
force and to
conformément au droit
ensure,
international humanitaire,
according to
la
international
protection des
humanitarian
populations
law, the
civiles
protection
et
of the
permettre
civilian
le retour
population
rapide
and
des
enable
civils
the
déplacés.
rapid return to
Le
those
droit
civilians that have
international
been
humanitaire doit pleinement
displaced.
s'appliquer.
International humanitarian
La
law
France
must fully
salue le travail
apply.
des agences,
We
fonds et
welcome the work
programmes
of
des
the
Nations
agencies,
Unies,
funds and
y
programs of the
compris
United
l'UNRWA,
Nations,
pour
including
venir en
UNRWA,
aide aux populations.
in assisting the
Madame la
population.
Présidente,
Madam
il est
President,
impératif
it is
que
imperative
tous les
that
otages soient
all of the
libérés sans
hostages be
condition,
released without
conformément au
condition,
droit
in
international
accordance with
et à ce
international
qu'a
law
exigé maintes fois
and
notre
what
Conseil.
this Council
Le
has so
Hamas
many
doit
times
aussi mettre un terme
demanded.
au
Hamas
traitement
must put an
dégradant et
end to the
humiliant
degrading and
infligé aux otages.
humiliating treatment
Et la
inflicted
France
on the
demeure
hostages.
solidaire des
And
familles
France
d'otages
continues to
et
stand
du
in
peuple
solidarity
israélien
with
face
the
au traumatisme
hostages
qu'ils ont
and the
subi.
Israeli people in the
Elle
face
ne
of the
cessera de
trauma they
condamner
have
les attaques
suffered.
terroristes
We
barbares
will always
commises par le
condemn the
Hamas et d'autres groupes
barbarous
terroristes
attacks
le
committed
7
by
octobre
Hamas and other terrorist
2023,
groups on the 7th of
qui
October
constituent
2023,
le pire
which
massacre
constitute the
antisémite
worst
depuis la
anti-Semitic
Shoah.
massacre since
La
the
France ne
Shoah.
cessera de condamner
We
les
will
violences
never
sexuelles
cease to
commises par
condemn
ces
the
groupes
sexual
terroristes.
violence committed
Le
by these
Conseil
terrorist
doit faire de
groups.
même.
The Council must do the same.
La France salue
France
les efforts
welcomes the
inlassables
tireless
des
efforts of the
États-Unis,
United
du
States,
Qatar,
Qatar,
de
and
l'Égypte
Egypt
pour faciliter les
in
négociations sur la
facilitating
poursuite du
negotiations
cessez-le-feu et la
for
libération
continuing
des
the
otages.
ceasefire and the release
Je
of
le disais
hostages.
auparavant,
I
les
referred to this
hostilités à
previously.
Gaza doivent cesser et
Hostilities in
ouvrir la
Gaza
voie à une
must
paix
end
durable.
and lead to
La
lasting
France salue
peace.
la
France
proposition d'un plan de
welcomes the
reconstruction de
proposal
Gaza
for Gaza
formulé
reconstruction
par les États
put
membres
forward
de la
by
Ligue
the
arabe
member states of
lors
the
du
Arab
sommet du
League
Caire.
at the Cairo
Le 4
summit
mars dernier,
on
nous
the 4th of
exhortons
March
l'ensemble des
last,
parties
and we would
à
call upon
prendre
all
appui sur
parties
les
to
atouts de
build
ce
on the
plan
strengths of
afin
this plan
d'avancer,
in order
notamment
to
sur les questions de
progress,
sécurité et de
particularly in the
gouvernance.
area of security and
Ce plan
governance.
doit
This
exclure le
plan
Hamas
must
de la
exclude
gouvernance de
Hamas
Gaza,
from
où
governance
le
in
mouvement
Gaza.
doit être
The
désarmé
movement must be
et il doit
disarmed,
apporter de
and it
solides
must
garanties de
provide solid
sécurité à Israël.
security guarantees to
L'avenir de
Israel.
Gaza ne
The
saurait
future
être
of Gaza
dissocié
must
d'un
go
règlement
hand in hand
politique
with a global
global
political
du
resolution
conflit
of the
israélo-palestinien.
Israeli-Palestinian
C'est
conflict.
dans cet objectif que la
And
France
it is with
co-présidera
this
en
goal
juin
in mind that
2025 avec
France in
l'Arabie
June
saoudite
2025
une
will
conférence
co-chair
internationale pour la
with
mise en
Saudi
œuvre de la
Arabia an
solution des deux
international
États,
conference on the implementation of
Israël
the
et la
two-state
Palestine,
solution, Israel and
ici à New York.
Palestine, here
Il
in
s'agit
New
de la
York.
seule voie
This is the
pour
only path
permettre aux
that will
Israéliens et
allow
aux
Israelis
Palestiniens
and
de vivre
Palestinians
côte à
to live
côte en paix et
side
en
by side
sécurité.
in peace
Mais pour
and
l'heure,
security.
l'urgence
But
est
for
à
the
la
moment,
cessation des
what is
bombardements,
urgent is to
à la
stop
reprise de
the
l'aide
bombing,
humanitaire et à la libération
resume
dans la
humanitarian
dignité
aid,
de
and to
tous les
release in
otages. Je
dignity
vous
all
remercie.
of the hostages. I thank
And
you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, señora
Thank
Presidente,
you very much, Madam
por
President,
convocar esta
for
sesión
convening this meeting.
y al señor Tom
And thanks
Fletcher,
to Mr. Tom
secretario
Fletcher,
general
Under
adjunto de
Secretary
Asuntos
General for
Humanitarios y
Humanitarian Affairs
coordinador del
and
Socorro de
Emergency Relief
Emergencia,
Coordinator, OCHA,
por su detallado
for
informe.
his detailed report.
Esta sesión
This
se
meeting
realiza en un
is being
contexto de
held
profunda
in a
preocupación
context of profound
por el
concern,
deterioro de la
given
situación
the
humanitaria en la franja de Gaza
deterioration of the
tras
humanitarian
las
situation in the
recientes
Gaza Strip
restricciones al ingreso de
following the
ayuda
recent
humanitaria.
restrictions on the entry of
Lamentamos
humanitarian assistance.
profundamente
We deeply
el
regret
deterioro del siempre frágil alto al fuego
the
que había
worsening of
brindado
the
un alivio
always
temporal a la
sensitive
población
ceasefire
civil.
that had provided temporary
Es
relief to
urgente
the civilian
que se
population.
retomen los
It's
esfuerzos
urgent
que
now that
sean
efforts be
necesarios
resumed,
para
all
restaurar la
necessary
calma
efforts
y
to restore
permitir el
calm
acceso
and
seguro de
enable
la
safe
ayuda que
access
tanto se
of
necesita.
assistance to those that need
Desde
it
el
so
1 de
much.
marzo,
Since the 1st of
el
March,
cierre de los
the
cruces
closure of the
fronterizos
border
ha
crossings
impedido
has
el ingreso
prevented
de ayuda
the
humanitaria,
entry of humanitarian
provocando una
assistance,
grave
leading
escasez de
to
alimentos,
serious
medicinas
scarcity
y
of food,
combustible.
medicines, and fuel.
Esto ha
This
puesto en riesgo
has
a miles de personas que desde
endangered
hace
thousands
mucho
of people
tiempo
who, for
dependen
so
de la
long,
asistencia
have
para
depended
sobrevivir.
on humanitarian assistance to survive,
Durante este
in
periodo del
particular
mes
during
sagrado del
this
Ramadán,
period of the holy
que
month of
más bien
Ramadan,
debería ser un tiempo de
which
paz
should
y
be a time of
recogimiento.
peace and reflection.
Tal como señala el
As
Programa Mundial
indicated
de
by the World
Alimentos,
Food Programme,
en los 42 días
in
de
the
cese al fuego,
42 days of the
se logró
ceasefire, it was
entregar
possible
más de
to deliver
40.000
more than
toneladas métricas
40,000
de
metric
alimentos en
tons
Gaza,
of food to Gaza,
brindando asistencia
providing
vital
vital
a
assistance to
1.3
1.3
millones de
million
personas.
people.
Sin embargo, a
Nevertheless,
partir del reciente cierre de
since
los
the
cruces,
recent closure
se ha
of the
impedido la
crossings,
entrada de nuevos suministros
it has
y la
not been possible
distribución de los
to
que ya habían
deliver new
entrado.
assistance.
La suspensión del
The
suministro
suspension
eléctrico,
of
según
the
OCHA,
electrical
ha
supply,
agravado
according
más
to
la
OCHA,
situación.
has further
La
worsened the
desconexión de la
situation.
planta
The disconnection
desalinizadora
of
del
the
sur de Gaza
desalination plant
ha
in the south of
reducido
Gaza has
drásticamente el
drastically
acceso al
reduced
agua
access to
potable,
drinking water,
afectando a unas
affecting some
600.000 personas
600,000
en
people
diferentes
in various
comunidades de la franja,
communities in the Strip,
lo que pone en grave
which
riesgo la salud
seriously
pública
endangers
y la
public
seguridad
health
humanitaria.
and humanitarian
En medio de
security.
esta crisis, es
In the
fundamental
midst of this
reconocer
crisis,
la
it's
labor
fundamental
incansable
to
de los
recognize the
actores
tireless
humanitarios
work of
que
the
trabajan en
humanitarian
condiciones
actors
extremas
who are
para
working in
aliviar el
extreme
sufrimiento de la
conditions to
población.
alleviate the suffering of the population.
Panamá valora el
Panama very
arduo
much
trabajo
appreciates the
humanitario
hard
que
humanitarian
permitió
work
vacunar
that is
contra
being
el
done
polio
to
a
make
más
it
de
that has been done
603.000
and made it
niños
possible to vaccinate
durante
more
la
than
tregua,
603,000
gracias a la
children
labor
against polio
conjunta
during the
de la
truce, thanks to the
OMS,
joint work of the
UNRWA
WHO,
y
UNRWA,
UNICEF.
and UNICEF.
Este esfuerzo
This
demuestra
effort
que cuando se
demonstrates
garantice el acceso
that
seguro
when safe
es
access is
posible
guaranteed, it
proteger
is
la vida
possible
de los
to
más
protect the
vulnerables.
lives of the most vulnerable.
Por ello,
That
es
is why it is
fundamental
fundamental
que se renueven
that
medidas que
measures be
faciliten el
renewed that
ingreso
will
de suministros
facilitate
de forma
the entry
segura
of
y
supplies
sostenible.
in a safe
Señora
and
Presidente,
sustainable manner.
Es
Madam
importante
President, it is
recordar que esta
important to
crisis
recall that
no es
this
solo el
crisis is
resultado
not
de medidas de control y seguridad
only the
que
result of
dificultan el
control and
acceso
security
humanitario.
measures that make it difficult to
El
provide
sufrimiento y la
humanitarian
destrucción que hoy
access.
observamos
The
en
suffering
Gaza
and destruction that
es
we see in Gaza
consecuencia
is the
directa en
direct
parte del accionar
consequence
extremista
of
de
the
Hamas y
extremist
de sus inhumanos
actions of
ataques del
Hamas
7 de octubre
and their
que
inhumane attack on the 7th of
desencadenaron
October,
esta trágica
which
espiral de
unleashed this
violencia.
tragic spiral of
A ello
violence.
se suma
To that,
ahora
we have to
la
now add
reciente negativa
the
de
current
Hamas a
refusal
cumplir con
of
los
Hamas
compromisos
to
asumidos en
meet
el
the
marco del alto al
commitments
fuego
agreed upon in
de
the
a
framework
liberar
of the
rehenes
ceasefire
adicionales,
and to
lo que ha puesto en
release
riesgo las
additional
vidas de
hostages.
miles de
This has
civiles
endangered
inocentes.
thousands of
Hamas
innocent
no solo
civilian
ha sembrado
lives.
el terror,
Hamas has not only
sino
sown
que ha
terror,
explotado el
but it
sufrimiento
has
de la
exploited the
población
suffering
gazatí
of the population
como
of
moneda de
Gaza
cambio
as a
político.
political bargaining chip.
Panamá ha condenado
Panama
y
has
condena esta
categorically
conducta de
condemned, and
forma
we do condemn this
categórica y exige la
behavior,
liberación
and we
inmediata e
demand the
incondicional
immediate and
de
unconditional
todos
release
los
of
rehenes
all
que permanecen
hostages
en
that
su poder.
remain in their power.
Señora Presidente,
Madam President,
por otro lado, ante esta dolorosa
on the other
realidad,
hand, looking at this
Panamá
painful reality,
también subraya
Panama would also like
que
to
cualquier
stress that
solución
any
sostenible
sustainable solution
debe estar guiada
must
por el
be
respeto
guided by
irrestricto a la
unconditional
dignidad humana
support for
y el
human
imperativo
dignity
moral
and the
de
moral
proteger a los
imperative
civiles.
of protecting
No
civilians.
debemos
We
permitir que
cannot
los
allow
inocentes continúen
innocent
pagando
people
el
to
precio de
continue
esta
to
tragedia.
pay the price for this tragedy.
Es momento
The time has
para que
come
las
for
partes
the
actúen con
parties to act
sensibilidad humana y con la
showing
voluntad
human
política
sensitivity and
constructiva
constructive
que
political will.
resulte necesaria
This is
para
what is
evitar
needed
más
in order to
sufrimiento
avoid
y para
further
salvar
suffering
más
and in
vidas.
order to save more lives.
Cualquier
Any
iniciativa
initiative
debe estar
must be rooted
enraizada
in
por la empatía más
the
profunda
deepest
y la
empathy
compasión
and
más
the
genuina.
most
No
genuine
se trata
compassion.
solo de llevar y
It's not just an
distribuir
issue of
alimentos y
providing and
medicinas.
distributing food and
Se
medicines.
trata de hacer los
It is
esfuerzos que sean
extending
necesarios
a hand
para
to the efforts that
alcanzar
are
las
necessary to
sensibilidades más nobles del alma humana que permitan tender una
ensure
mano
that
a las
a
personas
hand can be
para
extended
aferrarse a la
to
vida,
those that are
recuperar
clinging
la
on to life,
esperanza y creer que aún es
restoring their
posible
hope
un mañana
so
mejor.
that they can believe that a better
Panamá
tomorrow is
valora los
possible.
esfuerzos diplomáticos
Panama appreciates the
que se han
diplomatic efforts
desplegado y
underway
deben continuar
and that
para
should
restaurar el
continue
alto
in
al
order
fuego,
to
cuya
restore the
lamentable
ceasefire, which
interrupción ha agravado aún más
unfortunately
el
was interrupted, and this
sufrimiento
is
de la
further worsening the
población
suffering
civil.
of the civilian population.
Esos esfuerzos
These
deben
efforts
reanudarse,
must be resumed
intensificarse
and
para
intensified
promover la
in order
continuidad de
to
los acuerdos
ensure
que
the
dieron lugar
continuity
al
of the
cese al
agreements
fuego,
that led to the
ahora
ceasefire,
lamentablemente interrumpido,
which now
hasta
unfortunately
que se
has
logre
been
alcanzar el
interrupted,
desarrollo de todas sus fases con
and
éxito. Es
all facets
imperativo
of the agreement
que
must
se
be
retome el
implemented
camino
fully.
del diálogo y la mediación
Dialogue and
para
mediation must be
garantizar
resumed
la
in order to
liberación total,
guarantee the
inmediata
full
e
and
incondicional
immediate
de
and
los rehenes
unconditional
y el
release
acceso
of the
seguro
hostages
e
and safe
ininterrumpido
and
de la ayuda
uninterrupted access
humanitaria.
to
Muchas
humanitarian
gracias.
assistance. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam President.
Благодарим
We
заместителя
would
генсекретаря
like to
ООН
thank the
по гуманитарным
Undersecretary General
вопросам
for
Тома
Humanitarian
Флетчера
Affairs, Mr.
за
Tom
обстоятельный
Fletcher. Thank
доклад
him for a
о
detailed
происходящей
briefing
в Газе
on
рукотворной
the
человеческой
current
катастрофе.
situation in Gaza, which is a man-made human catastrophe.
Когда делегация Алжира и
When the
Сомали
delegation of
запрашивали наш
Algeria
сегодняшний
and
брифинг
Somalia has asked
для
for the
обсуждения
briefing today so
деградирующей
as to
гуманитарной
discuss the
ситуации в секторе Газа,
deteriorating humanitarian
они
situation in
вряд ли
Gaza,
могли
they
предположить, что
probably could
накануне
not have
произойдет
thought
резкое
that on
обострение
the eve
ситуации,
of a meeting the
и все
situation will
договоренности о прекращении огня
worsen even
практически
further,
будут
and all
обнулены.
ceasefire agreements will basically have
В ночь на
come to naught.
18 марта авиация
In the
Израиля возобновила
evening
авиаудары
on
по
the
Газе,
18th of
которые
March,
привели
the
к новым
Israeli
жертвам.
aviation resumed airstrikes against Gaza, which
Сообщается о
resulted in new
более чем
victims.
400
We have
погибших,
information of more than
а также о
400 people
подготовке
dead,
Сахал
and that the
к
IDF
наземной
is
операции в
preparing
анклаве.
for a land operation in the Strip.
Таким образом,
This
режим
way,
прекращения огня был
the
нарушен,
ceasefire
и
regime
трагедия простых
was
палестинцев
violated, and
приобрела
the
новое
tragedy
измерение.
of Palestinian civilians have
Эта
taken on
трагедия
a new
разворачивается на
dimension.
наших
This
с вами глазах уже
tragedy
полтора
is
года.
unfolding in front of our
За
very
время
eyes for a year
военной
and a half.
операции Израиля
And in the course of the
от
military
сектора и
operation
так
by
практически
Israel,
ничего не осталось,
there's basically
кроме
nothing
дымящихся
left
руин.
of the Strip except for
А
the
счет
smoldering
погибших мирных
ruins. And
газоветян
the number
перевалил за
of
48 тысяч.
Gaza civilians who have died is more
Гуманитарный
than
кризис в анклаве
48,000.
приобрел
The humanitarian
поистине
crisis
библейские
in the
масштабы.
Strip
масштабы,
has
что
become
подтверждают и
truly
представленные
biblical
сегодня
in
оценки
nature, and this is
УНПЛА ООН.
supported by the assessments today of the UN
Разрушены больницы и
humanitarians.
практически вся
The
базовая жизненная
hospitals and
инфраструктура.
basically the basic
Сотни тысяч
infrastructure is
газовитян
destroyed.
месяцами
Hundreds of
выживают под открытым
thousands of
небом,
people in
на
Gaza
улице
are
среди
surviving
завалов,
out in the
в
open, out in
условиях
the street
острого
amongst
дефицита
rubble.
продуктов
There's
питания,
an acute shortage
антисанитарии
of
и отсутствие
food. There is no
предметов первой
sanitation and the
необходимости.
absence of basic goods.
При этом у людей,
At the same
пребывающих
time,
в
the people
отчаянии,
who
нет ни
are in
малейшего представления
desperation
о
have
завтрашнем
no
дне.
idea what tomorrow
Прекратятся
will
ли
bring,
военные
whether
действия?
the military
Будет ли
activities
кто-то
will stop,
восстанавливать
will
их
someone is
жилища?
going to
Как
rebuild their
будут выживать их
houses, and
дети?
how their children are going to survive.
Эти вопросы сегодня, к сожалению,
Those
звучат еще более
issues
остро, поскольку
today,
действия Израиля
unfortunately, are
вновь
sounding
отбросили нас
even
в
more
неизвестность.
urgently because what was being done by Israel has
Она
thrown
охватила
us
не
back
только
into
палестинцев,
uncertainty. And
но и
this
тех в Израиле,
is
кто ждет
covering
возвращения
not
домой
only
удерживаемых всех три заложников.
the Palestinians, but also those who are waiting
Как
for
заявило
hostages to
сегодня
come back
объединение семей
to
заложников,
Israel. The
израильское правительство
Association
решило
of
поступиться
Seven
ими
Hostages
и
families
выбрало
stated
сознательный
today
подрыв
that the
процесса,
Israeli
который должен был
government had
привести к их
decided to
возвращению.
sacrifice them and undermine the very process that should have
Вместо
resulted
этого,
in their
как мы все видим,
return.
вновь возобладала
Instead of that,
логика
what we're
удавливания
seeing is
газовитян
the
со своей
logic
земли.
of edging the Gaza people out of
И
their
это при том,
land
что,
has
несмотря
prevailed.
на все
And
лишения и
this is at the
страдания за гранью
time when
человеческих
all
возможностей,
of the suffering,
жители
which is
Газы,
beyond human
как свидетельствуют
comprehension, the people
многочисленные
in Gaza,
источники,
as we know from
никуда не
many
хотят
sources,
уходить
do not
и
want
видят
to
свое
leave,
будущее только на
and
родной
they
земле.
only see their future as a
Это их
future on their
выстраданное право,
homeland. This
а
is the right
обязанность
that they have
международного
suffered for,
сообщества
and
сделать
the
все,
duty of
чтобы оно было
international
реализовано.
community is to make sure that everything is done,
Газовитяне
that
должны
this right
получить
is
шанс на
implemented.
безопасное,
They
достойное
have to
будущее
get a
на
chance
территории
for
анклава,
a
а
safe
палестинский
and
народ в целом
dignified
на
future
создание своего
in the Strip,
государства.
and the Palestinian people as a whole a chance for creating their state.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam
уважаемые
President,
коллеги,
distinguished
в
colleagues,
складывающихся обстоятельствах
under
Совет
the current
Безопасности ООН должен
circumstances, the
сделать все
Security
возможное
Council
для
has to do everything
безотлагательного
possible
восстановления
to
режима
make sure
прекращения
that
огня
there is a resumption of
и для
ceasefire as quickly
возобновления
as possible,
выполнения
and that there is
договоренности
a
между Израилем и
resumption
Хамас.
of the implementation of the agreement between
Мы не
Israel
должны
and
повторять
Hamas.
прежних
We
ошибок.
should not repeat
Ведь
the
число
mistakes
погибших в
of
Газе за эти
before. The
1,5 года
number
мирных
of
палестинцев
Gazans
столь велико, в том числе и
died
потому, что Совет
over
Безопасности
the
ООН не смог принять
recent
решение о
time
более
is
раннем
so high
установлении
because
режима
the Security
прекращения
Council
огня.
was unable to make an earlier
Это горький
decision on
урок,
the ceasefire. And this
который
is a
члены
very bitter
Совета
lesson
должны усвоить и
that
не
the Security
повторять.
Council members
Ведь
should learn
никакие
and not
политические
repeat,
соображения не могут
because no
оправдать
political
подобного промедления,
considerations can justify
стоившего
such a
жизни такого числа
delay which
мирных жителей.
resulted in the lives lost for such a
В
high
период
number of
с
people.
19 января по 2
Since from
марта, когда
19th
в силу
January to the
вступили
2nd
договоренности
of
между
March, when
Израилем
the
и Хамас,
agreements between
у населения
Israel
сектора
and
появился
Hamas
проблеск
took
надежды.
into force, the
Доступ в
people
анклав
of
был
Gaza saw a
разблокирован,
glimmer of hope
гумдеятельность
because the access
активизировалась,
was
а
unblocked, there was
организации
greater
системы ООН
humanitarian
воодушевленно
activity,
отчитывались о
and the
наращивании
UN
поставок
system bodies
и результатах этого окна
reported
возможностей,
of greater
несмотря на низкие
supplies and
шансы
the
на
window of
дальнейшую реализацию
opportunity,
сделки.
despite the fact that there were low chance
К
for further
сожалению, этот
deals
проблеск
implementation.
надежды
Unfortunately,
угас так
this
же
glimmer
быстро,
of
как и
hope
вспыхнул.
went out as quickly as it
Западный
appeared.
Иерусалим
West
снова закрутил гайки.
Jerusalem once again tightened
И
the
вот уже как
screws,
2
and
недели
for
жители
2
Газы
weeks
вновь
now, the
столкнулись с
people in
блокадой,
Gaza have been
перспектив снятия
facing a
которой не
blockade, and
просматривается.
there are no prospects for it being lifted.
Сегодня же эта блокада стала еще
Today,
более
the blockade
бесчеловечной.
has become even more
Власти
inhumane.
Израиля
The
подвергают
authorities of
обструкции работу
Israel are
международных
obstructing the
гуманитарных
work of
организаций и
international
агентств,
humanitarian organizations and
запрещают ввоз
agencies. They
любых
prohibit
грузов
any
и коммерческих
humanitarian
товаров, обрекая
supplies and
население на
commercial
еще
goods
большие
coming in,
страдания.
and they're dooming the people in Gaza to
Насколько мы
further
можем судить,
suffering.
сегодня
As far
пункты
as we can
пропуска были
say, the
закрыты совсем.
crossings have been closed altogether today.
Отключение 9 марта от электричества
Cutting
опреснительной
off
станции, о
the
которой уже
power on the night
говорили
of March
мои
from the
некоторые коллеги,
desalination
еще
plant, and
один
my colleagues
случай
mentioned
откровенного
that
пренебрежения
is yet another
международным
instance
гуманитарного
of a
права со стороны
blatant
Западного Иерусалима.
disregard to international humanitarian
Это
law on the
решение,
part of West
которое, к
Jerusalem.
слову, не имеет
This
никакого
decision,
военного
by the way,
смысла,
is of no
ставит
military
сотни тысяч
import,
людей под угрозой
but it brings
смерти
hundreds of thousands
из-за
of
того,
people
что
to
они
the brink
лишены
of
доступа
death
к чистой
because they
питьевой
have no
воде.
access to clean drinking water.
Вдумайтесь, на
Give it some
сегодняшний
thought,
день только
please.
каждый 10-й житель
Today, only
анклава
1
может
out of
позволить
every
себе
10
чистую
people
питьевую
in the
воду.
strip can have
Последствия
access to
такой
clean drinking
ситуации
water.
будут
The consequences of such a
в том
situation will
числе и
be
потому, что в
catastrophic.
таких условиях
Inter alia,
крайне
because, of
велик риск масштабного
because under these
распространения
conditions,
инфекционных
there's a great
заболеваний,
risk of
а
widespread
возможности оказания
infectious
медицинского
diseases.
содействия, как мы
On the
видим,
other hand,
в
providing
анклаве
medical
практически нет.
assistance, as we can see, are basically absent in this strip.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President.
самую серьезную
And the most
озабоченность вызывает
serious
продолжающийся кризис
concern
вокруг
is
БОПОР.
caused by continued
Откровенная
crisis
травля
with
агентства и
UNRWA.
соответствующее
The
решение
open
Кнессета о
prosecution
запрете
of
его
the agency, the
функционирования на
Knesset
некой
decision to
суверенной
ban
территории
its
Израиля
functioning on what's
лишь
being called the
дополняют
sovereign
картину
territory of
преднамеренного
Israel
подрыва
only adds to
гуманитарного
the picture
реагирования в
of
анклаве.
an intentional undermining of the humanitarian
Невозможно
response in
оспорить
this strip.
важнейшее
It's
значение БОПОР
impossible
для
to
палестинских
argue with
беженцев,
how
как и нельзя
important
отрицать тот
UNRWA
факт,
is for the
что именно эта
refugees,
структура ООН
nor can one
продолжает
deny
играть
that this is
безальтернативную
the
роль
UN
в
body that's
предоставлении
playing an
содействия газовитянам.
irreplaceable role in providing assistance
Вновь
assistance to
заявляем
the
о
people
нашей
in Gaza.
непоколебимой
We
поддержке
once again
КПОР
state with
и
our
напоминаем о роли
unflagging
агентства в
support for
процессе
UNRWA and
ближневосточного
recall the role the
регулирования,
agency played in
включая
Middle
решение
East
одной из
settlement,
проблем окончательного
including
статуса
dealing with
палестинских беженцев.
one of the final status issues, namely the Palestinian
На этом фоне
refugees.
мы слышим от израильских властей
Against this
заявление
background,
о
we hear
наличии у
from
них некого
Israel
плана,
the statement that
предусматривающего
they have
взятие
some kind of
Западным
a plan
Иерусалимом под свой
whereby
полный
Western
контроль
Jerusalem would take
поставок
full
и
control
распределения
over the
гуманитарной
supply and
помощи.
distribution of humanitarian assistance.
Подробностей на
There
этот
is
счет
very few
немного, но
details
есть все
on this
основания
plan,
полагать,
but
что
there is
этот
every
план
reason to
в
think
случае
that
его
this plan,
реализации
in case it's
не только
implemented,
существенно ограничит
will
операционные
not
возможности
just
международных
seriously
структур в секторе
limit the
Газа,
operational
но и подорвет
possibilities for international
функционирование
bodies in
созданного в
Gaza,
соответствии с
but
решением Совета
also will
Безопасности ООН механизма
undermine the
2720.
2720 mechanism which was
Ясно и то,
created
что
under
заменой
a Security
масштабных
Council
ООНовских
decision. It
гуманитарных
is
усилий
also clear
подобный
that
план
such a
быть не
plan
может.
cannot replace a large-scale UN
Ситуация еще больше
humanitarian
усугубляется
assistance.
тем, что
The
Израиль, как
situation is
оккупирующая
further
держава,
compounded by the fact
отказывается
that
нести
Israel as an
ответственность за
occupying power
обеспечение
is
потребностей
refusing to
населения,
shoulder the
находящегося на
responsibility
оккупированной
for
территории.
providing the needs of the people
Мы все
under
видим, что
occupation.
такие понятия,
We
как
can
забота о
see
населении
that
или защита
such
гражданских лиц,
notions of the
не
care for the
значатся
people or
среди
protection
принципов
of
и методов
civilians are not
проведения ЦФА в
among the
военных
principles and the
операциях,
methods
осуществляемых
used by the
задействованием
IDF
тяжелой техники и
in the military
авиации как в
operations
секторе
where they
Газа,
used
так и
heavy
на западном
weaponry
берегу реки
in the
Иордан,
Strip and in the
положение на
West
котором
Bank.
членам Совета
And the West
Безопасности
Bank
ООН еще
situation
предстоит
is
обсудить в
something
эту
that
пятницу.
we are going to discuss this Friday.
Гуманитарные структуры ООН
The
доказали, что
humanitarian
способны,
bodies of
особенно в
the UN
условиях
have
прекращения
shown
огня,
that they can,
вести
especially if there's a
результативную работу в
ceasefire,
анклаве и
conduct
спасать
effective
жизни
work
людей.
in the Strip and save people's lives.
Их нужно всемирно
They need
поддерживать,
to be
защищая
supported as much
гуманитарщиков
as
от
we can
репрессивных
and
действий со
protect
стороны Западного
humanitarians from
Иерусалима,
prosecution
которые носят
on behalf
исключительно
of West
политический
Jerusalem, and
характер.
this is purely political in nature.
Страдания людей
The
не
suffering
должны
on people
использоваться в
should not
качестве
be
инструмента
used
ведения
as
войны,
a weapon of
шантажа и
war,
рычага давления
blackmail,
как на
or
Хамас,
a
так и
lever
на
of
все
exerting
международное
influence
сообщество.
on Hamas
А именно
and the
это сейчас и
international
происходит.
community as a whole, and yet this is exactly what's happening.
Госпожа председатель, мы
Madam
решительно
President,
осуждаем
we
введенные
strongly
Израилем
condemn
меры
the measures
и
introduced
считаем,
by
что их
Israel and
применение
think that their
представляет собой
use
ключевое
is a
препятствие на
key
пути к
obstacle
облегчению
on
страданий
the
2
road
миллионов
towards
израильтян.
easing the suffering of 2 million
Призываем
people in
израильские власти
Gaza.
к
And we
немедленному
call on the
прекращению огня, а
Israeli
также
authorities to
к отмене
immediately lift the
рестрикций на проведение
restrictions and
гуманитарных
to
операций на всей
end the
оккупированной палестинской
restrictions on
территории,
humanitarian
включая
action
сектор
in
Газа
the
и западный
entire
берег реки
OPT,
Иордан.
including the
Вновь
Strip
подтверждаем
and
нашу
the West Bank.
последовательную и
We
неизменную
reiterate our
линию на
consistent and
императив
constant
безусловного и постоянного прекращения
line
огня,
for
освобождения всех
a
заложников и удерживаемых
ceasefire,
лиц,
the release of all hostages
налаживания
and
беспрепятственного
detainees,
гуманитарного
ensuring there's
доступа на
unimpeded
оккупированную
humanitarian
палестинскую территорию,
access to the
а
OPT,
также на возврат
and
к мирному
their
процессу
return
на
to the
основе
peace
формулы
process on the
двух
basis
государств
of
для двух
the
народов.
two states for the two peoples formula.
Убеждены, что
We
без
are
справедливого и
convinced that
долгосрочного
without a
регулирования,
just and
обеспечивающего
lasting
законные права
settlement,
и чаяния
ensuring the
палестинцев на
legitimate
создание собственного
rights
государства в
and
границах
aspirations of Palestinians
1967
to have their
года
own
со
state
столицей в
within
Восточном Иерусалиме,
1967 border with a
порочный
capital
круг
in East
взаимного насилия
Jerusalem,
и
without that,
кровопролития
a
на Ближнем
vicious
Востоке
circle
не
of
разорвать.
bloodshed and violence in the Middle East will not be
Благодарю за
broken.
внимание.
I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General Fletcher for his briefing. I also want to thank him for his efforts, and I want to thank and recognize sacrifices made by the humanitarian workers in Gaza and the region. You are doing everything you can. I would like to make 4 points. First, in conflicts, we as Slovenia don't take sides. We stand with peace, protection of civilians, and international law. We entered the Security Council with an idealistic aim of helping extending the zones of peace, protecting civilians, and promoting respect for the international law. And yet it seems so difficult to work for peace. It seems so difficult for warring parties to surrender to peace. Today, Israel resumed hostilities, setting in motion a new wave of strikes and evacuation orders. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed just today, and 2 million of them are facing a new cycle of hardship, destruction, and relentless fear. We condemn these attacks, and we call on Israel to stop them immediately. Second, Slovenia has been supporting calls for the ceasefire time and again, and we continue calling on the parties to return to the agreement made with the support of mediators and guarantors, the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, in line with the Council Resolution 2735. 6 weeks of ceasefire has offered
a much-needed relief to the people in Gaza and to the people of Israel, finally reuniting them with hostages. The Council should now be focusing on discussing the plans of rebuilding of basic infrastructure and reconstruction, in line with the vision provided by our Arab partners. This should be the time we launch a process leading to two-state solutions. Instead, we are back to pleading for sparing lives of civilians, Palestinians, and hostages, and for allowing food and water deliveries to Gaza. This is wrong in so many levels. Humanitarian aid and access to basic goods and services, including electricity, cannot be politicized. International law is clear, and it must be respected. Crossings to Gaza must be opened. Aid must flow in, and humanitarian operations must run unimpeded. Third, we want to express our extreme concern over the information of plans related to humanitarian space, humanitarian bubbles, or whatever euphemism one likes. We also underline our strong rejection of any plans for a settlement of Palestinians. Fourth, it is roughly a year from the ICJ binding order on provisional measures focused on humanitarian aid, famine, and starvation in the case brought forward by South Africa. It is unacceptable that our conversations are still the same and that Council resolutions and ICJ orders are disregarded. Madam President, to conclude and to summarize, the resumed killing and destructions must end. Aid is not negotiable. It should not be weaponized. We denounce these actions, just as we denounce hostage-taking by Hamas. In Gaza, both Palestinians and hostages are being sacrificed. This vile war should not continue being fought on the shoulders of civilians. This is not only tragic for Palestinians and hostages in Gaza, but also for the credibility and relevance of the Security Council as the body responsible for maintenance and of international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, USG Fletcher, for your sobering briefing. I also want to thank Algeria and Somalia for calling this meeting, an initiative which the UK fully supports, considering the alarming humanitarian situation. President, this meeting comes at a critical moment. As my Foreign Secretary has said, the civilian casualties from Israeli strikes overnight are appalling. I want to be clear. A return to fighting will only result in the deaths of more Palestinian civilians, Israeli hostages, and IDF soldiers. This conflict cannot be resolved through military means. We want to see the ceasefire re-established as soon as possible. The humanitarian situation in Gaza was already catastrophic. After 17 days, Israel continues to block all aid entering Gaza. Crossing points have been shut off. Bakeries are closing. Hospitals and desalination plants are running on generators that could stop at any moment. This is horrifying and unacceptable. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a political tool. We are calling for the following urgent steps to bring this terrifying situation back from the brink. First, we call for the protection of civilians and for safe, rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access. We call on Israel to fulfill its international obligations and allow for a rapid and unhindered resurgence in the flow of aid. This includes the supply of items such as medical equipment, shelter items, and water and sanitation equipment, essential to meet humanitarian and early recovery needs in Gaza, but which remain restricted. Failure to deliver this not only risks undoing the vital humanitarian progress made during phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement, it also risks violating international humanitarian law. Second, we urge all parties to return urgently to dialogue and to implement the ceasefire agreement in full, including scaling up aid and releasing the 59 hostages who've been cruelly held by Hamas for over 500 days and have endured unimaginable suffering. For Israel to be secure, these terrorists can have no role in Gaza's future. But cutting off aid and resuming the fighting is not a means to this end. Finally, we reiterate that civilians of Gaza who've suffered so much must be allowed to return to their homes and rebuild their lives. Colleagues, we urge all parties to return to the ceasefire deal and get back to the path of peace. A negotiated two-state solution is the best way to ensure long-term security for both Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President, for responding to this urgent meeting request, and to USG Tom Fletcher for his opening briefing. Colleagues, Middle East currently stands at a turning point, and the long-awaited ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza was a great example of what could be achieved through political will. We are seriously alarmed by the resumption of hostilities in Gaza and the new huge death toll, and we call on all parties to show restraint and resume the ceasefire talks. Following the profound shock of October 7, 2023, Greece maintained a principled stance. We express our condemnation of Hamas terrorist attack and the ongoing detention and cruel treatment of the hostages, and we reiterated our demand for the immediate and unconditional release. The people of Gaza have endured a second winter under extremely difficult circumstances. Tom Fletcher today and other briefers who have preceded him in this council have tried to describe living conditions almost beyond our comprehension. We echo the calls for humanitarian aid to flow back to Gaza immediately and the crossings to open as soon as possible. Reports by OCHA and the World Food Programme of the inability to transport food supplies into Gaza due to the closure of all border crossing points is of utmost concern. The suffering of the civilian population must come to an end. We call on Israel to allow and facilitate the safe, unconditional, massive and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale and restore access to electricity and water, as well as to ensure the protection of civilians and other protected persons, including humanitarian workers, in line with international humanitarian law. Millions are in urgent need of primary health services, education and shelter, as Gaza territory has been reduced to rubble. Thousands of children were left dead, injured, separated from their families, and internally displaced. Hence, the unhindered and continuous flow of aid into all parts of Gaza should remain a priority. UNRWA's role remains pivotal and indispensable. We support all efforts to ensure that humanitarian aid reaches Gaza and have consistently supported the Cypriot-Amalthea Maritime Corridor and other initiatives in this regard. Within the EU, we took an initiative so that EU member states can assume the treatment of injured and sick children from Gaza. In this context, we welcome 10 children and their families from Gaza who are currently receiving treatment in Greek hospitals. OCHA warnings of increased settler violence across the West Bank is also alarming, as is the displacement of people, the unfolding security situation in Jenin following the intensification of operations and terrorist attacks in the West Bank. Madam President, we need a permanent ceasefire that can pave the way for the release of all remaining hostages and for the reconstruction of Gaza. In this vein, we welcome regional efforts to cohere the single plan for the next phase in Gaza, and we stand ready to support and develop these ideas further. The Arab plan put forth by Egypt is a constructive proposal on the table. We are clear that any plan must not have no role for Hamas, must ensure Israel's security, must not displace Palestinians from Gaza. Any scenario of displacements would jeopardize regional stability and security, and it would undermine the prospect of achieving the two-state solution. Reconstruction efforts should also include governance and security arrangements, while ensuring the leading role of an empowered and informed Palestinian Authority in this process, capable of exerting effective governance over the West Bank and Gaza. It should also be ensured that Hamas will be excluded for any planning on the day after in Gaza, and that it will never pose a threat to Israel's security. For this to happen, though, the Palestinian Authority needs to be supported financially and institutionally, and Greece remains committed to providing assistance in this direction. Madam President, the political process must remain as a core objective of our collective efforts. We support the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state on the basis of the two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our new colleague from France. And we thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher for his very sobering briefing on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. Madam President, we are at another tragic milestone in the war in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. This war and the manner in which the Security Council and the international community respond to the atrocities and actions that have been taken will have a lasting impact on the nature of the world order which we and succeeding generations inherit. 50,000 plus people have been killed in Gaza, 150,000 injured, and 2/3 of them have been women and children. Attacks on hospitals, schools, mosques, civilian centers. Every principle, every article of international law and international humanitarian law have been blatantly violated with impunity. Defying the resolutions of the General Assembly, of the Security Council, of the International Court of Justice. Unless the international community responds with justice to what has happened and is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories, our world order is likely to regress into the barbarism from which the Charter of the United Nations was supposed to rescue us. Madam President, the agreement of 15th January for a ceasefire, for a three-phase ceasefire, offered a sliver of hope for the Palestinian people, for the Israeli people, and for the world community. Phase 1 of that agreement was implemented, and serious consideration was continuing for the negotiation, elaboration, and implementation of phase 2 and 3 of the agreement as outlined in Resolution 2735 of the Security Council. The Arab and OIC Reconstruction and Peace Plan was under consideration in capitals. It offered a road to peace. But obviously, This glimmer of hope and hope for peace was not to the liking of the extremist leaders who rule Israel today. They see their survival in the continuation of the war. But is this in the interest of the hostages? Is this in the interest of the Israeli people? Is this in the interest of the Palestinians? And is this in the interest of world order? I think the answer is obvious. The first tactic to erode the ceasefire agreement was the imposition of the humanitarian blockade, an attempt to extort concessions beyond the ceasefire agreement of 15th of January. Blocking trucks, cutting off electricity and water, restricting NGOs, preventing access for Muslims to access the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy month of Ramadan. These are all tactics of the oppressor. And now they have escalated to blatantly violate the ceasefire and resume attacks against the helpless Palestinians in Gaza who were just returning to rebuild their homes. 400, mostly men, mostly women and children were killed just last night. And if this bombing and artillery attacks continue, hundreds more may be dying as we speak. The Security Council's response must be clear, must be quick, and must be just. Firstly, we must demand a halt to the Israeli attacks in Gaza and the implementation of Resolution 2735. I would like to add that even if there are military targets in civilian facilities, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, there is a prohibition to attacking such targets, even if there are military targets within those civilian facilities. It is a clear injunction of international humanitarian law and cannot be offered as an excuse for the killing of civilians, innocent men, women, and children. Secondly, we hope and ask that the negotiations on phase 2 and phase 3 of the ceasefire agreement reflected in Resolution 2735 must be resumed. We call for full implementation of all phases of the Gaza ceasefire agreement, including permanent and comprehensive cessation of Israeli hostilities, return of displaced persons to their homes, withdrawal of Israeli forces, opening all crossings, adequate humanitarian access to all parts of the Gaza Strip, and a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Gaza. 3, humanitarian assistance must be immediately resumed, and the restrictions that have been imposed must be lifted. According to Amnesty International, Israel's, and I quote, Israel's decision to block humanitarian aid to Gaza is a war crime and amounts to collective punishment of the civilian population. It's a continuation of the policy to impose on Palestinians conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. This is genocide, unquote. Madam President, we demand that adequate funding should be provided for coordinated efforts that are crucial to enable OCHA's 2025 flash appeal for the occupied Palestinian territories to be funded. Donor contributions today are only 173 million of a 4 billion that is required. And UNRWA's unparalleled capacity to deliver emergency, shelter, food, and medical assistance is irreplaceable and must be allowed to operate without obstruction. Fourthly, and President, the Israeli aggression in the West Bank must end. Forced displacements, illegal land annexations, and settler violence must be reversed in accordance with Security Council resolutions 2720 and 2334. Finally, Madam President, we must ensure the revival of a credible and irreversible political process towards a two-state solution and the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state within the pre-67 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. This is the only viable path to durable peace. The upcoming June conference, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, is an important opportunity for the peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question and the implementation of the two-state solution. But, Madam President, to realize the possibility of peace, Israel's aggression, its attacks, and its slaughter of the Palestinians must stop. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank USG Tom Fletcher for his detailed briefing on the dismal humanitarian situation in Gaza. Madam President, we are gravely alarmed by Israel's renewed offensive in Gaza, causing hundreds of fatalities, including scores of children today alone. We are also seriously concerned over the precarious fate of the hard-won agreement for ceasefire and release of hostages, as well as the quickly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. As repeatedly stressed by the members of the Security Council, it is clearly Israel's illegal obligation under international humanitarian law to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, including 1 million children. Hostage taking by Hamas is unacceptable under any circumstances. It must be condemned by all members of the Council. And we repeat our demand that all hostages be released immediately and unconditionally. However, Hamas' refusal to carry out its obligation does not justify blocking humanitarian aid or using it as a bargaining chip, which is unacceptable. and strictly prohibited under international law. Neither does it justify the resumption of an intensive military offensive, causing massive civilian casualties. We take note of the horrifying remarks by USG Tom Fletcher during his press briefing last Wednesday, sharing what he witnessed in Gaza in January. And I quote, "I said to my colleagues, why are the dogs so fast? Why are the dogs so fed?" And he said, because the dogs are looking for curbs. And you notice that the people are thin for miles and miles and miles, unquote. During the implementation of the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, we witnessed the crucial impact of political will in easing the immense suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. However, once again today, we are seeing and feeling with shock and concern a grim sense of deja vu in relation to the unfathomable sufferings, insecurity, destruction, and hunger that has haunted civilians in Gaza for more than a year. Madam President, the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th and Israel's massive military operations resulting in extreme anguish highlight once again the imperative to move toward a just and long-lasting solution to the conflicts between Israel and Palestine. A sober approach based on the acknowledgement of the legitimate rights and concern of both Israelis and Palestinians is the only option for durable peace and stability in the region. We call on Israel to immediately cease the offensive and all parties return to the negotiating table. We hope the mediating countries, including the US, Qatar, and Egypt, exert utmost effort to secure the ceasefire and the release of hostages. We believe that all phases of the ceasefire agreement endorsed by the Council through Resolution 2735 should be implemented in full, leading to the release of all hostages, a permanent end of hostilities, and the swift beginning of reconstruction based on international law. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Thank you, President.
我感谢
I
阿尔
thank
及利亚和索马
Algeria
里
and
参与召
Somalia
开今
for
天的
calling
会议，
today's meeting,
感谢
and
弗莱彻
thank
副秘书长的
USG
通
Fletcher
报，
for the briefing.
也欢迎
I
法国
also
的
welcome
新任
the
PR。
new PR of France.
在1月19日，加
With
沙
the
10天停
implementation
火
of the
后，
ceasefire
加
on
沙
January
民众获
19,
得了
people
期
in
盼已久
Gaza
的喘
had
息，
a long-awaited respite,
人道灾难一
and
定程度上
humanitarian
得到了
disaster
缓解。
was relieved to some extent.
但在第一阶段
However,
停火于
as
3月
the
1日
first
到
phase
期
of
后，
ceasefire expired on March
停火
1st,
协议
the
未能
ceasefire
进入
agreement
第二阶段。
failed to enter the second phase.
尽管国际社
In
会
spite of the
强烈
strong
呼吁
calls
延
from
长
the
加沙
international
停火，
community to extend the Gaza
尽管加
ceasefire,
沙民众盼
and
望
the strong
强烈
desire
盼
of the
望恢复
Gaza
和平安宁，
population for the resumption of
局势
peace and
依
tranquility,
然朝着
the
反方向
situation
发
has
展。
moved in opposite direction.
以色列3月2日
On March
宣
the
布
2nd,
停止
Israel
向
announced
加
the
沙提
decision
供
to
人道
halt
援
the
助。
entry of humanitarian
3 月
aid
9
to
日切
Gaza.
断
On
加
March
沙
the
电
9th,
力
it
供应。
cut off the supply of power to
就
Gaza.
在昨天，
Just
以色
yesterday,
列对
Israel
加沙
launched
发动了大规模的空袭，
large-scale airstrikes on
造成
Gaza,
了数
causing
百平民伤
hundreds
亡。
of civilian casualties.
中方对来
China
之不易的停火局面
regrets
被破
the
坏感
harm
到遗
done
憾，
to the hard-won ceasefire,
对以色列在加
and
沙
is
再次挑起战火表示严重关
gravely
切，
concerned about Israel's resumption of
并予
hostilities
以
in
强烈
Gaza.
谴责。
We strongly condemn this.
我们强烈敦促
We
放
strongly
弃
urge
武力至上
the
的迷思，
abandonment of the force logic of
军事
supremacy
手
of
段
force.
不是解
Military
决
means
巴以
is
问题
not
的出路。
the way to solve the Palestine-Israel
15个月
question.
的血腥冲突
和42天停火的鲜明对
The
比已经
stark
清楚说
contrast
明，
between 15 months of
滥
bloody
用武
conflict
力
and
不
42
是
days
解
of
决人
ceasefire
质的
clearly
正
shows
确方式，
that indiscriminate use of force is not the right way to bring back hostages,
反而可能给他们带
and
去
may
更多的
even
危
put
险。
them at greater risks.
中方敦促以色
China
列
urges
放弃
Israel
使
to
用武力的执
renounce
念，
its obsession with the
立
use of
即停
force,
止对加沙的
immediately
军事
cease
行动，
military operations in Gaza,
停止对加
and
沙平民的
stop
集体惩罚。
the collective punishment of the Gazan civilians.
我们强烈要
We
求实现
strongly
加沙持
demand
久停
a
火。
permanent ceasefire
既
in
然达成了
Gaza.
停火协
The
议，
ceasefire
就
agreement
应
was
当
reached.
以善
As
意、
such, it
严
should
肃
be
的态
fully
度
and
全面
seriously
执行，
implemented in good faith,
而不能寻求
and no
中途
attempt
更
should
改
be made to
和
alter
破坏协
or
议。
undermine it midway.
中方呼吁当事
China
方
calls
全
on the
面连
parties
续
to
落实停
implement
火
the
协议，
ceasefire agreement
期
fully
待
and
停火协
continuously
议的
and
保障国
expects the
秉
ceasefire
持
guarantors
公正、
to
负责
adopt
任
a
的态
fair
度，
and responsible approach
推动
to
3阶段协
facilitate
议
the
连贯执行，
continuous implementation of the
确保
three-phase
在加沙
agreement
实现
and
持久停
ensure
火。
the realization of a permanent ceasefire in Gaza.
我们强烈反对
We
把人道
strongly
救援武
oppose
器化
the
和政治化的
weaponization and
行为。
politicization of
截
humanitarian
止今
aid.
天，
As of
已经
today,
连续17
for
天没有
70
任何人道
consecutive
物资
days, no
进入加
humanitarian
沙，
supplies were allowed
海
into
水淡
Gaza,
化厂也
and
因
the
失
loss
去
of
电
power
力供应
disabled
难
a
以运转，
desalination
导
plant,
致水资源短
worsening
缺危
the
机加
water
剧。
shortage crisis.
把人道救援
The
作
use
为
of
谈判
humanitarian
筹码，
aid as a bargaining
违
chip
反国际
is a
法，
violation of
特别是
international
国际
law,
人道法，
especially international
中方予以
humanitarian
谴
law.
责。
China condemns such practice.
我们敦促以色列
We
履行
urge
占领方的国际
Israel to
人道
fulfill
法
its
义务，
obligations
立即全
as
面恢复
occupier
加
under
沙的
international
人道物
humanitarian
资
law
补
and
助。
immediately restore full humanitarian access to Gaza.
我们强烈呼
We
吁重振
strongly call
两国方
for
案
the
的政治前景，
reinvigoration of the political prospects
落
of the
实两国
two-state
方案
solution.
是解决巴
The
勒斯坦问
implementation
题
of the
的
two-state
唯
solution
一
is
可
the
行
only
出路。
viable way to resolve the
加
question
沙
of、
约旦
Palestine,
河西岸，
Gaza,
包
and the
括
West
东
Bank,
耶路撒冷，
including
都
East
是巴勒
Jerusalem,
斯
are
坦国不
all
可分割的组
inseparable
成部分。
parts of the Palestinian state.
我们支持埃
We
及和阿拉
support
伯
the
国
Gaza
家共
recovery
同
and
发起的
reconstruction plan
加沙
jointly
恢
initiated
复
by
和重
Egypt
建
and
计
other
划，
Arab states,
支持
and
以巴人治
support
巴原则
an early
尽快
launch of
开启重
reconstruction
建，
underpinned by the principle of Palestinians governing
让巴
Palestine,
勒斯坦人民在
whereby
自己
the
领土
Palestinian
上
people
重建
can
家园。
rebuild their homes in their own territory.
国际社会应加
The
大努
international
力
community
推
should
进
step up
两国方
its
案的政
efforts
治
to
进程，
advance the political
并为
process
此
of the
提供必
two-state
要的保
solution and
障。
provide necessary support to this end.
主席，
President,
过去一段时
for
间，
some
我
time
们
now,
在
we
中东地区目
have
睹了一
witnessed
个危
a
险的迹象。
dangerous sign in
国
Middle
际
East,
法治和国际
as the
秩序
international
遭
rule
到
of law and
违反
international
和
order
削弱，
are violated and undermined.
弱肉强
The
食的
law
丛林
of
法
the
则似
jungle
乎正在
seems
大
to
行其
reign.
道，这令人担忧
It
和
is
关切。
worrisome and a cause for
安理
concern.
会作
The
为维
Security
护国
Council,
际和平与安全的
as
首
the
要机
primary
构，
body for maintaining
应当
international
及
peace
时
and
制止
security,
这种乱
should
象。
put a timely end to such chaos.
我们支持安理
We
会
support
为推动加
further
沙持
actions
久
by the
停火，
Council to bring
恢
about a
复中
permanent
东地
ceasefire
区
in
和平，
Gaza,
实现
restore
巴勒斯
peace
坦
in the
问
Middle
题
East,
全
and
面、
achieve a
公正、持
comprehensive,
久解决，
just,
采
and
取进一
lasting
步的行
solution
动。
to the Palestinian
谢
question.
谢主席。
Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Denmark. And I would like to join to colleagues in thanking Undersecretary Fletcher for his sobering briefing and his very detailed description of the many achievements achieved during the ceasefire. At the outset, let me express Denmark's shock and sadness over the news coming from Gaza about the many civilian casualties following the Israeli airstrikes last night. Let me be clear, this violence must stop. The terms of the ceasefire must be respected. A ceasefire that can pave the way for the release of all remaining hostages and ensure much needed humanitarian humanitarian aid to the civilians of Gaza. We urge all parties to show restraint. Denmark has repeatedly underlined the need to ensure the protection of civilians in line with international humanitarian law. We reiterate this call today. Colleagues, as we've heard several times this morning, the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains catastrophic. The recent Israeli decision to block all further humanitarian assistance and to cut electricity to the enclave is rendering the situation even more desperate and threatens to reverse progress made during the first phase of the ceasefire. The consequences are already starting to emerge. The lack of supplies has meant that humanitarian partners are reducing food rations. UNICEF reports that roughly 1 million children in Gaza are now once again living without basic necessities for survival. The recent resumption of hostilities will only worsen this suffering. Denmark continues to condemn Hamas' terror attack of October 7 and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. The safety and well-being of these hostages is of great concern, and we regret that Hamas has failed to allow humanitarian access to them. Colleagues, international humanitarian law is clear. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a bargaining chip or a political tool. This applies to all parties in a conflict. As the occupying power, Israel is obliged under international law to ensure the protection of civilians and ensure the civilian population does not lack food or other basic needs, including water. Civilians of Gaza have suffered enough. The sustained supply of aid is indispensable to the survival of over 2 million Palestinians. They have the right to receive humanitarian aid. They have the right to clean water, to food, to medicine. We call on the government of Israel to abide by its obligations under international law, to ensure full, rapid, safe, and unhindered provisions of humanitarian assistance to the population in Gaza, and to ensure the protection of civilians and other protected persons, including humanitarian workers, in line with international humanitarian law. The immediate threat of malnutrition in Gaza is already affecting thousands of children and pregnant and breastfeeding women. The decisions to withhold humanitarian aid and limit the production of clean drinking water are likely to have long-term consequences for the health of Gaza's population, as well as longer-term prospects for socio-economic recovery. Colleagues, the massive task of reconstructing Gaza lies before us. We need a permanent ceasefire as a first step to be able to address this challenge. We call on parties to find a way forward to the next phases of the ceasefire agreement that should hopefully lead to a permanent ceasefire. We commend the regional efforts through the Arab Recovery and Reconstruction Plan presented at the recent Cairo summit. We maintain that any plan for the future of Gaza must have no role for Hamas, must ensure Israeli security, and must not displace Palestinians from Gaza. In closing, the civilian population in Gaza have already endured too much suffering for far too long. They are looking to this council for support. Around this table, we have a responsibility to act, to urgently work towards a two-state solution, the only viable path to lasting peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Let me reiterate Denmark's unwavering commitment to this goal. And I now resume my functions as President of the Council. I give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to thank you for the convening of this urgent meeting at this critical time, and to thank Algeria and Somalia for requesting it on behalf of the Arab group, as well as China, France, Guyana, Pakistan, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom for their support to this request. Allow me also to thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher, who has recently visited Gaza and the region, for his relentless efforts and for his sobering and alarming briefing. Madam President, this meeting was originally requested to discuss Israel's weaponization of humanitarian aid for collective punishment purposes, with Israeli leaders confessing to it publicly. They're not denying it or claiming, as they have done in the past, that hundreds and sometimes thousands of truckloads of humanitarian aid is in Gaza Strip. This time now, they made the decision to weaponize it, to use it, to stop it publicly. They're not denying it. no longer feeling the need to even keep up pretenses. We were supposed to gather here to discuss how an entire civilian population who had survived a genocide and with still immense needs was yet again confronted with fuel and electricity being cut off, leading to the shutdown of essential water and sewage treatment facilities, worsening the already dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza, so-called evacuation orders to advance, forcible displacement, and all this coupled with the hermetic siege denying the entire civilian Palestinian population life-saving aid since the beginning of the month. Now, we gather here after a series of deadly Israeli attacks that killed last night alone hundreds of Palestinians. Current reports indicating over 400 killed and nearly 600 injured in the span of few hours during the night last night, reminiscent of the criminal bombardments our people endured for over 15 months. The same images are back to haunt us. Small children on Garnia's little siblings, injured and disoriented, trying to comfort and reassure each other. Entire families killed, children, mothers, fathers, searching for their loved ones under the rubble, not knowing if they are dead or alive. Bombardments, death, devastation, fire, and fear are yet again spreading throughout the Gaza Strip. And this is all happening during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, 1 year after the councils chose this same period, given its significance, to call for the first time for a ceasefire to hold the genocide and stem unimaginable human suffering. In our tradition, nobody would fight during the month of Ramadan. This is from the beginning of time. But yet, the criminals, cruel, selfish leaders of the government of Israel, of the occupying authorities, do these things in spite of traditions and respect for religion and humanity. Madam President, Palestinians are being killed indiscriminately, are being denied humanitarian aid indiscriminately, are being maimed and detained indiscriminately. We condemn these crimes in the strongest possible terms. This can never be justified and must stop immediately. Must stop immediately. And I agree with you, Madam President, when you said that you have a responsibility around the table to act. You are the Security Council. Act. Stop this criminal action. Stop them from denying our people food in the month of Ramadan and water and the hospitals to operate. Act. You have resolutions. Act. You have power. Act. Or, as my friend, the ambassador of Slovenia said, you become irrelevant. Act according to the power given to you by the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, ceasefire works. It is the only thing that does. It stopped the bloodshed. It allowed the entry of humanitarian aid Israel had long denied. It allowed the release of hostages and prisoners. It allowed for the starving people to be given sustenance, for the sick and wounded to receive medical care, as the tenets of international humanitarian law and our very humanity oblige. Life was starting to triumph over death. Our collective role is to ensure life prevails, and that requires ensuring the full and effective implementation of Resolution 2735. Resolution 2735 is unequivocal. It clearly spells out the terms of each phase and the obligations of each side. It also clearly states in relations to phase 2, which includes release of hostages and full withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from Gaza, that the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations continue. And negotiations will keep going until all the agreements are reached and phase 2 is able to begin. There should not be unilateral, self-serving, and irresponsible decisions to execute breaking the ceasefire. While the Trump administration has prioritized the release of hostages, it is evident that Netanyahu's concern for his political selfish survival far outweighs his concern for the survival of the hostages. Madam President, the resolution is also clear in rejecting any attempt at demographic or territorial change in the Gaza Strip, including any actions that reduce the territory of Gaza, a goal Israel continues to pursue as mass forcible displacement and annexation remain its primary aims throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. The resolution also reiterates the Council's unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions, and stresses the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. This is the only way forward. This is the only way forward. Sustaining the ceasefire, implementing it in full, and transforming it into a clear and immediate pathway to Palestinian independence and ceasefire for all. Act now. You can act not to allow the ceasefire to be broken, not to allow the starvation of the Palestinian people. Act now. Madam President, the State of Palestine and Arab countries, with the support of many around the world, have exerted every effort to ensure that Gaza in particular and Palestine as a whole are set on a different trajectory towards life and liberty, to change the reality our people has been for too long endured, and to change forever and for the better our region, for the benefit of all states and all peoples. A clear vision accompanied with a solid plan was endorsed by the Arab Summit and supported by the OIC ministerial meeting and has been welcomed worldwide. And many of you in your statements referred to your support to what was adopted in the Arab Summit conference. A small ray of hope was appearing on the dawn of the possibility of changing the tragedy in the Middle East to something that is different and promising. And perhaps that's why the criminal extremist leaders of Israel who do not want to allow this ray of possibility to flourish, they did what they did last night in order to destroy the efforts of all of us to open the door of peace. They are trying to close that door and to open the door of war and destruction and killing people. These efforts should be supported. The efforts of the Arabs, the OIC, and all of you that you've referred to should be supported, not compromised and sabotaged. They offer the only viable path away from conflict and towards peace. They have transformative power. Allow them to flourish. Allow them to become the new reality. Don't allow the other option of war and destruction and taking away lives, especially of children and women. Peace saves lives. War takes lives. Act. Choose peace. We, Palestine and Arab countries, are acting responsibly and with resolve to end this conflict once and for all. We are acting responsibly and with resolve to end this conflict once and for all. We will spare no effort, and we need all the help we can get. Help us. Act. We want peace. We have a plan. We have an alternative. We have options. It is crystal clear. Help us. Act with us to make peace is the option of the world, and make war not acceptable and need to be stopped, and ceasefire to prevail. This starts with supporting the Arab plan for reconstruction, which many of you refer to, supporting the Palestinian government's assumption of its responsibilities throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, the deployment of a UN-mandated mission throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, achieving a complete, comprehensive, and permanent ceasefire, and supporting an end of the occupation, Palestinian independence, implementing the two-state solution, and achieving shared peace and security. This is a historical moment where everyone must choose where they stand and what vision they want to see prevail. The next few days are decisive and can either set us on the right path or the wrong one, with huge implications for the region and the world. Help us in these few days to have the ceasefire in place, not the continuation of war. Life must prevail. Liberty must prevail. Peace must prevail. You are the mighty Security Council. Act, help us, and I thank you very much, Madam President.
And I thank the permanent observer I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. We stand firm in our commitment to return the hostages and defeat Hamas, and it's time for the international community to take our commitment seriously. We will bring home every last hostage. Hamas has refused to release our hostages and repeatedly rejected all the offers, both by the US and the mediating countries, even for the period of Ramadan. And thus, the return to fighting is a necessity. The IDF is attacking targets of the Hamas terrorist organization to achieve our objectives. These precise attacks include Hamas terrorist commanders, terrorist cells, launch posts, weapon stockpiles, and additional military infrastructure that are being used by these terrorist organizations to continue to plan and execute attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers. However, we are drawn into a discussion today not to alleviate suffering, not to seek truth, but to indulge the political agenda of certain members of this council. Those who wield humanitarian rhetoric and feign concern as a weapon, turning a blind eye to the primary cause of suffering in Gaza, the Hamas terrorist organization, which continues to hold 59 innocent hostages. For those truly concerned about humanitarian crises, there is one that should be paramount: the hostages still held in Hamas's brutal captivity. Men, women, children, the elderly, innocents ripped from their homes and subjected to horrors beyond comprehension. Many are already believed to be dead, while others continue to be tormented day after day. For over a year and 4 months, they have been deprived of sunlight, medical care, the comfort of their family's embrace. Their conditions are unknown, their treatment unimaginable. This is the most urgent humanitarian crisis, and yet those who claim to be the loudest voices for human rights have somehow lost their voices on this matter. So let us be clear: any discussion of humanitarian suffering that does not begin with the hostage release is not an honest discussion. For months, Israel took unprecedented steps to facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel's war is against Hamas, not Gaza's civilians. And yet, despite our efforts, Hamas refuses every opportunity for peace. It refuses to release the hostages. Over a 6-week period between January and February alone, Israel facilitated the entry of an unprecedented amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza, over 25,000 aid trucks, averaging more than 4,200 trucks per week. These trucks carried food, medical supplies, and essential goods. This is not speculation, not political rhetoric. This is in fact documented, verifiable, and confirmed by the organizations distributing and supplying the aid. In addition to the thousands of aid trucks, bakeries are operational across Gaza, producing millions of loaves of bread daily. In northern Gaza alone, increased fuel deliveries resulted in a 40% increase in bakery output. The slander that the people of Gaza are currently starving is quite simply untrue. Fuel and gas deliveries also continued over this period. Nearly 1,000 fuel tankers entered Gaza, including 275 to the north. Claims that the electricity cutoff has plunged Gaza into humanitarian collapse are greatly exaggerated, particularly regarding water infrastructure. Water pipes and sewage repair materials were sent to northern Gaza, ensuring that infrastructure remains functional. During the same 6-week period, over 840,000 tents were delivered. This was a massive logistical undertaking supported by international partners and facilitated by Israel. Madam President, let us be very clear. If there is suffering in Gaza, it is not because of a lack of aid. It is because Hamas has hijacked an entire civilian population for its own violent ends. Hamas diverts food, Hamas hoards fuel, Hamas transforms hospitals, schools, and UN facilities into command centers, ensuring that even in the presence of humanitarian aid, suffering persists.
But somehow, in the debates of this council, Hamas is an afterthought, a footnote, a mere inconvenience in the preferred narrative. And so, instead of asking why Hamas continues to prolong this war, instead of asking why Hamas rejected a ceasefire extension that would have freed civilians from suffering, instead of asking why Hamas holds hostages in horrific conditions, instead of asking these questions, certain members choose instead to malign Israel, the only party in this conflict undertaking their humanitarian obligations and taking steps to meet them. Israel will not be lectured by those who exploit human suffering for political gain. If this council wishes to address suffering, then it must demand the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. There can be no progress until this occurs. There can be no relenting against the evil that we face. The massive amounts of humanitarian aid which Israel coordinated and facilitated, at least those amounts not seized by Hamas, have reached every segment of Gaza's population, with one tragic exception: the hostages. While Gazan civilians benefit from food, medicine, shelter, and support, these innocent individuals languish in conditions that defy human comprehension, a stark reminder of the vast moral inequivalence between Israel and Hamas. The release of the hostages is the first, the most urgent, the most fundamental step towards ending this war. The people of Gaza deserve a future free from Hamas and the pain that they wrought. The innocent Israelis wasting away in Hamas's tunnel network must once again feel the sun on their faces and embrace their loved ones. This is the only true path to peace. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Majid Abdulaziz, Permanent Observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank
يسعدني
you,
أن
Madam
ألقي هذا
President.
البيان اليوم
I'm
باسم
honored to
جامعة
make this
الدول
statement today
العربية
on behalf
ودولها
of the
الأعضاء
League of Arab States and its
ونستهله
member
بالإعراب
states.
عن التقدير
I would like to
لرئاستكم
begin by
المتميزة
expressing our
للمجلس
appreciation for your
ولاستجابتكم
excellent
لطلب المجموعة العربية والجامعة
stewardship of
العربية
the work of the
ودول
Council and for
أخرى
positively
عديدة
responding to the
لعقد
request
هذه
by the
الجلسة
Arab Group, the League of Arab
وتعزيز
States
العمل
and other
الدولي من
member
خلال
states
مجلس
to hold
الأمن
this meeting to
للتصدي
promote
لاستئناف
international work
إسرائيل
through the
لتصفيها
Council
العسكري
to
الوحشي
address
لقطاع غزة
Israel's resumption of
وللتدهور
its
المستمر
brutal
للوضع
military
الإنساني في
bombardment of
القطاع
Gaza and for the
نتيجة
continued deterioration
للقيود
of the
التي
humanitarian
فرضتها
situation
وتفرضها
in the Gaza Strip due
إسرائيل
to
على
the
إدخال المساعدات
continued
الإنسانية
restrictions by
في
Israel
استمرار
on
لسياسة
the
التجويع
entry of
والتعطيش
humanitarian assistance
المحرمة
in the
دوليا
continuation of the
ونعرب
policy
في نفس
of
الوقت عن كل
starvation and
التقدير
forced
لوكيل
thirst that
السكرتير
is
العام
internationally
للشؤون
prohibited. We would
الإنسانية
like
توم
to express
فليتشر
our appreciation
على
to USG
إحاطته الهامة
Fletcher for the important
واقتراحاته
briefing
البناءة.
and the constructive
سيدة الرئيسة،
suggestions.
سبق أن
Madam
أكدت
President,
القمة العربية
the
في إعلان
Arab
البحرين
Summit
في
in the
16 مايو
Bahrain declaration
2024
on the 16th of May
وعودت
2024
القمة
has
التأكيد
stressed,
في بيان
and
القاهرة
this has been
الصادر عن
reaffirmed in
القمة
the
العربية غير
Cairo
العادية التي
communique
عقدت
of
تحت
the
شعار
extraordinary
قمة
Arab Summit
فلسطين في
that was
4
held under the
مارس
slogan
2025
Palestine
على
Summit
إدانة
on the 4th of
سياسات
March
التجويع
2025.
والأرض
Both
المحروقة
have condemned
الهادفة لإجبار
policies of
الشعب
starvation and
الفلسطيني
scorched
على
earth
الرحيل من
tactics
أرضه.
aimed at forcing the Palestinian
وشددت
people
قمة
to leave their
القاهرة
land.
على
The
إدانة
Cairo
القرار
Summit
الصادر مؤخرا عن
condemned
الحكومة
the
الإسرائيلية
Israeli
بوقف
government's recent
إدخال
decision to
المساعدات
hold
الإنسانية
humanitarian aid to Gaza
لقطاع غزة
and
وغلق
close
المعابر
relief
المستخدمة في أعمال
crossings.
الإغاثة. كما قررت
The
القمة
summit
رفض
also
استخدام
decided to
إسرائيل
reject
لسلاح
Israel's
الحصار
use of
وتجويع المدنيين
blockade
لمحاولة تحقيق
as
أغراض سياسية.
a weapon
كما
and the
شددت
starvation
على
of
الأولوية
civilians as a
القصوى
means to achieve
لاستكمال
political gain.
تنفيذ
It
اتفاق
also
وقف
stressed
إطلاق
the
النار
utmost priority of the
لمرحلتيه
continuation of the
الثانية
implementation of the
والثالثة.
second and third phases
ويؤكد
of
كل ذلك
the
سيدة
ceasefire
الرئيسة
agreement.
على الرابطة
All
الجوهرية
this,
بين
Madam
التوصل
President,
للوقف
stresses
الكامل
the crucial
والشامل
link
لإطلاق
between
النار
the
وفقا
comprehensive and
للاتفاق
full
الذي تم التوصل إليه
ceasefire
بالوساطة الأمريكية
in accordance with the
المصرية
agreement
القطرية
based
والسماح
on
بدخول
the
المساعدات
US, Qatari,
الإنسانية
and
بدون
Egyptian
انقطاع
mediation and to
وبكثافة عالية
allow the entry of
والبدء
humanitarian
فورا في
assistance
تنفيذ
without
المرحلة
interruption and in big
الأولى من
volumes,
الخطة
as well as
التي
starting the
اقترحتها
implementation of the
جمهورية
first
مصر
phase
العربية
of the plan
بالتنسيق
proposed
الكامل مع
by
دولة فلسطين
Egypt in full
والدول
coordination with the
العربية
state of Palestine and Arab
واستنادا
states,
إلى
and
الدراسات
based on
التي أجريت
studies
من قبل
that
البنك
were
الدولي
conducted by the World
والصندوق
Bank
الإنمائي
and the
للأمم المتحدة
UNDP
بشأن التعافي
on
المبكر
early
وإعادة إعمار
recovery
قطاع
and the
غزة
reconstruction of the Gaza
واعتمدتها
Strip.
قمة
This
القاهرة
plan was
باعتبارها
adopted by
خطة
the Cairo
عربية
Summit as
جامعة
a pan-Arab
واعتمدها
plan,
الاجتماع
and it was
الوزاري
also adopted by the
لمنظمة
ministerial
المؤتمر
meeting of
الإسلامي
the
بعد ذلك.
OIC at a later point in
فبعد أن
time.
قتلت الحرب الإسرائيلية
The
على غزة
Israeli
والتي
war on
استمرت لأكثر
Gaza
من
of more
470
than
يوما
470
أكثر من
days have
48 ألف
killed
فلسطيني،
more than 48,000
منهم ما يقرب من
Palestinians,
18 ألفا من
including
الأطفال
18,000 children
و13 ألفا من
and
النساء،
13,000 women.
وخلفت تدميرا
And it
شبه كاملا
almost
للمنشآت
completely
الصحية
destroyed health
والتعليمية
and
والبنية
educational
التحتية
and
وكل
infrastructure
مقومات الحياة
facilities
في
and
غزة.
all necessities of
فلا
life in
شك أن
Gaza.
استئناف القصف
The
العسكري
resumption
الوحشي
of
المكثف
the brutal
لقطاع غزة
military intensive
واستشهاد
bombardment
أكثر
of the
من
Gaza Strip
400
and the
فلسطيني في
the
غزة
killing of more
أمس
than
فقط،
400 Gazans in
وتكثيف إسرائيل من
Gaza
تنفيذ سياسة
yesterday, and
التجويع
Israel's
والحصار على
intensification
قطاع
of the
غزة،
policy of
والتي
blockade and
تمثل
starvation
آخرها
on the
بقرار
Gaza
وزارة
Strip.
الطاقة
And the
الإسرائيلية
most
بقطع
recent of
التيار
which was the
الكهربائي
decision by the
على
Israeli
المنشآت
Ministry of
الحيوية
Power
بالقطاع،
to cut
بما في ذلك
the power
محطات تحلية
supply
المياه
to the vital
الرئيسية،
sectors, including the
الذي
main
أضاف
desalination
التعطيش إلى
water plant.
التجويع،
This has added
ويفاقم
forced
من
thirst
معاناة
to
أكثر من
starvation.
مليوني
It
فلسطيني
aggravates the
يعيشون
suffering of
في
more than
ظروف
2 million
قاسية
Palestinians living
قاهرة.
in unbearable conditions.
كل هذه الهجمات
These
والإجراءات
attacks
اللا
and
إنسانية
measures
المدانة
are
والمرفوضة
inhumane,
لا
condemned,
يمكن
and
توصيفها
unacceptable.
إلا كعقاب
They
جماعي
are nothing but collective
تنتهجه
punishment
إسرائيل
by
بحق الشعب
Israel,
الفلسطيني
perpetrated by
الأعزل
Israel
وعلى
against
نحو
the defenseless
يتنافى
Palestinian
والقيم
people,
والمبادئ
which runs
الإنسانية
counter to
التي تقوم عليها
humanitarian
ومن
principles and
أجلها
values,
هذه المنظمة،
which constitute the very foundation
ويشكل
and mission of this
تحديا
organization.
للإرادة
This is a
الدولية
challenge to the
التي
international will
ساندت
that
وقف
has
إطلاق النار.
supported the ceasefire.
ومع تفاقم الأزمة على هذا
In
النحو
light of the
واستئناف
deterioration of
إسرائيل
this
لقصفها
crisis and
العسكري
Israel's
المكثف
resumption of
لقطاع
its
غزة أمس،
intensive military
تشدد المجموعة
bombardment in
العربية على
Gaza
حتمية
yesterday,
أن
the
ينهض
Arab
مجلس
group
الأمن
stresses that the
بمسؤولياته هذه
Council
المرة،
needs to shoulder its
وأن
responsibility
يجبر
this
المجلس
time and to
إسرائيل على
compel
الوفاء
Israel to
بالتزاماتها
honor its
بموجب
obligations
اتفاق وقف إطلاق
under the
النار،
ceasefire
بما في
agreement,
ذلك فتح
including
كافة
opening
المعابر
all
أمام المساعدات
crossings
الإنسانية
to
والإيوائية
humanitarian aid
والمستلزمات
and
الطبية
the
والوقود،
delivery of medical
وإعادة
and
التيار الكهربائي
fuel
للقطاع
items
بالكامل،
and shelter items, and to
بما
restore
في ذلك
electricity to the
محطات
entirety
المياه
of the strip,
وتلبية
including the
الاحتياجات
water plants,
الأساسية
and to
للسكان
meet the basic
والتخفيف
needs
من
of the people
معاناتهم.
and to alleviate their
وتحذر
suffering.
المجموعة
The group
من تبعات إخفاق
warns
المجلس
against
في اتخاذ هذه الإجراءات،
the council not
والتي
taking
ينذر
such
بخطر
measures,
وقوع كارثة
which ushers
إنسانية
in
كبرى
a catastrophic
لن تحمد
human
عقبها.
disaster with
كما
unpredictable
تؤكد
consequences.
المجموعة
The
والجامعة
Arab group
العربية على أن
and the
استمرار
League of
هذه
Arab
الأزمة
States
ومنع أو
stresses that the
عرقلة
continuation
وصول
of this crisis
هذه
and
المساعدات
obstruction of delivery of aid
يمثل انتهاكا
or
جسيما
preventing
لالتزامات
aid from
إسرائيل
getting
القوة
in
القائمة
is a
بالاحتلال
major and a
بموجب
grave
القانون
violation of
الدولي
Israel's
والقرارات الأممية وقواعد
obligations
حقوق
as the
الإنسان
occupying power
واتفاقية جنيف
under the
الرابعة
international law,
للعام
UN resolutions, and the
1949،
rules of human
لا
rights,
سيما
and
الرأي
before the Geneva
الاستشاري الصادر
Convention
عن
of
محكمة العدل
1949
الدولية
and the
في
advisory
يوليو
opinion of the ICJ
2024 والإجراءات
issued in
المؤقتة
July
الصادرة
2024
عن
and the
محكمة
provisional
العدل
measures
الدولية
of the
وما
ICJ as
صدر
well,
من الجمعية
and
العامة
all the
ومجلس الأمن من قرارات
resolutions adopted by
بناء
the Security
عليه.
Council and the GA based
كما
on the
تؤكد
ICJ measures and
المجموعة
orders.
والجامعة
The
العربية على
group
ضرورة
and
تفعيل
the
مجلس
League
الأمن
stress that
لآليات
the
الرقابة
Council
الدولية
needs to
لضمان وصول
activate
المساعدات
international
بشكل
oversight
آمن
mechanisms
ومستدام
to
إلى جميع
guarantee the delivery
الفلسطينيين
of aid
المحتاجين،
safely and
وعلى
in a
ضرورة
sustainable manner
تعزيز
to all
الجهود الدولية
Palestinians in need.
لضمان
There needs to
حماية
be a promotion of
المدنيين
international efforts
الفلسطينيين
to ensure the
وتلبية
protection of
احتياجاتهم
civilian
الأساسية
Palestinians and to meet
بشكل
their basic
فوري
needs
وفاعل.
immediately and
وتؤكد
effectively.
في هذا
We
الإطار
stress
على
in this
مركزية
regard
الدور
the
الإنساني
central humanitarian
الذي تطلع به وكالة
of
الأونروا
UNRWA
في غزة
in Gaza,
والذي لا يمكن
which cannot be
استبداله بأي
replaced by
جهة
any
أخرى،
other entity.
وتشدد
We
على
stress
أهمية ضمان
the
استمرارها
importance of the
في
continued
تأدية
work of
خدماتها
UNRWA to provide
الحيوية
its vital services
للاجئين
to
الفلسطينيين
Palestine
وفق
refugees
تكليفها
according
الأممي.
to its UN mandate.
Excuse me. السيدة الرئيسة،
Madam
تشيد
President,
المجموعة
the
العربية
Arab
بالجهود
group
المضنية
commends
التي قادتها
the
مصر وقطر
tireless
والولايات
efforts
المتحدة
spearheaded
في
by
التوصل إلى
Qatar,
اتفاق
Egypt, and the
وقف
US
إطلاق النار في
to
غزة،
reach a
بما
ceasefire
في ذلك
agreement
إطلاق
in
سراح
Gaza,
الرهائن
including the
والمحتجزين
release of detainees and hostages.
وتؤكد على
We stress
ضرورة ممارسة
the need
مجلس الأمن
for the
أقصى ضغط
Council
على
to
إسرائيل
exercise utmost pressure on
لوقف
Israel
عدوانها
to
العسكري
end its
الذي
military aggression
استأنفته
that was
بالأمس
resumed
ولاستكمال
yesterday
تنفيذ
and to
اتفاق وقف
complete the
إطلاق النار
implementation of the
مما
new
يشمل
ceasefire agreement,
مرحلتيه
including
الثانية
the second and
والثالثة
third phases
وجميع بنوده.
and all its elements.
الأخرى
This,
وبما يؤدي إلى
this would
التوصل إلى
lead
الوقف
to
الدائم
reaching
للعدوان
a
على غزة
permanent
وانسحاب
end of
إسرائيل
the
كليا من القطاع
aggression on Gaza
وتيسير
and
عودة
Israel's
أهالي
full
غزة إلى
withdrawal from
مناطق
the strip,
سكنهم
and to
بما في
facilitate
ذلك
the
شمال
return of
القطاع
Gazans to
تماشيا
the
مع
areas of
قرارات
residence,
مجلس الأمن
including in the
وأبرزها
north, in
القرار
line with Security Council resolutions,
2735.
most notably Resolution 2725.
وتؤكد المجموعة والجامعة
The group and
على
the league
أهمية
stress
البناء على
the
هذه
need to
الجهود
build
من
on
أجل
those
الشروع في
efforts
تنفيذ
to
الخطة
begin the
العربية
implementation of the
للتعافي
Arab
المبكر
Early
وإعادة
Recovery
إعمار
and
غزة
Reconstruction Plan.
كما نثني على
We
جهود مصر
commend
ودولة
the efforts
فلسطين
of
في
Egypt
التحضير
and the State of Palestine
لعقد مؤتمر
to prepare
دولي
for
حول
international
إعادة
conference
الإعمار
on
بالتعاون مع
reconstruction
الأمم
in
المتحدة
cooperation with the
والذي
UN,
ستستضيفه
which will
القاهرة
be
في
hosted by
المستقبل القريب
Cairo
ونحث
very
الشركاء
soon.
في المجتمع
And we
الدولي
urge our
والمؤسسات
international
المالية الدولية
community
على
partners
توفير
and
كل الدعم
IFIs to
السياسي
provide
والمالي
all
لضمان
financial
تنفيذ
and
هذه
political
الخطة
support
الطموحة
to
وبالأيادي
ensure the implementation
الفلسطينية
of this
بغية إعادة
ambitious
تأهيل
plan
القطاع
by
وإعماره
Palestinian
بالسرعة
lands
المنشودة
towards the
كما
rehabilitation
نشدد
and
معا على
reconstruction of
أهمية
the
تزامن
strip
تنفيذ هذه
at the
الخطة
desired pace.
مع
We
إطلاق
stress the
جهد
importance
دولي
that
فاعل
this
يهدف إلى
plan
تحقيق
would
السلام الدائم
coincide with
بما
international
يحفظ
effort
الحقوق الكاملة
towards
للشعب
sustainable
الفلسطيني
peace
ويحقق
and lasting
تطلعاته
peace to
المشروعة
protect the rights
لإقامة
of the
دولته
Palestinian people
المستقلة
and to achieve their
وانضمامها
aspirations in
كعضو
freedom and
كامل
statehood
بالأمم المتحدة بما في ذلك السعي
and
الدولي
joining the UN
لإنجاح
as a
المؤتمر
full-fledged member
الدولي
and
الذي
the
سيعقد بالأمم
effort to make
المتحدة في
the
يونيو
international conference that will be
2025
held in June
تحت الرئاسة السعودية
2025
الفرنسية
under the
ضمن جهود
French-Saudi
مبادرة حل
presidency is
الدولتين
success as
التي
part
تلقى
of the
دعما
two-state
دوليا
initiative
متزايدا
effort
كل
that
يوم.
is
ختاما
receiving
سيدة
mounting
الرئيسة
international support
تجدد
every
المجموعة
day.
العربية وجامعة الدول العربية
In
التأكيد
closing,
على
the
تضامنها الكامل
Arab
مع
Group
الشعب
and the League of Arab
الفلسطيني
States
وعلى
reaffirms their
دعمها
full
القوي
solidarity with the
لصموده
Palestinian
التاريخي
people and their
على
strong
أرضه
support to its
وتمسكه
historic
بها
steadfastness of
ورفضه
its land
التغيير منها
as it
وتؤكد على أن
adheres to
استمرار
its land
العمليات
and
العسكرية
refuses to be forcibly
والحصار
displaced. We
والتجويع
stress that continued
والتعطيش
military operations,
والإجراءات القمعية
siege,
التي
starvation,
تقترفها
forced
إسرائيل
thirst, oppressive
لن
measures
يؤدي إلا إلى
perpetrated by
مزيد من
Israel will
التدهور في
only lead
الأوضاع
to further
الإنسانية
deterioration of the
والأمنية
humanitarian and
مما
security
يهدد
situation,
أمن المنطقة
threatening the
بأسرها
security of the entire region.
ونجدد
We
تأكيدنا
reiterate
على أن الحل
that the
الوحيد
only
لهذا
solution
الصراع
to this conflict
يكمن في إنهاء
is
الاحتلال
by ending the
الإسرائيلي
Israeli occupation,
وضمان حق الشعب
guaranteeing the right
الفلسطيني
of the
في تقرير
Palestinian people to
المصير
self-determination
وإقامته
and the
دولته
establishment
المستقلة
of their
ذات
independent
السيادة
sovereign state
وعاصمتها
with
القدس
East
الشرقية
Jerusalem
على
as its
أساس
capital
حل
on the basis
الدولتين
of the two-state
ومبادرة
solution
السلام
and the Arab
العربية
peace initiative
وانضمام دولة
and
فلسطين
the state of
كعضو
Palestine
كامل
joining as a
العضوية في
full-fledged
الأمم
member of
المتحدة.
the United Nations. I
شكرا
thank you,
سيدتي الرئيس.
Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abdulaziz for the statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I couldn't help but notice that some of the behavior during this meeting, including departing from the chamber and leaving a seat vacant while the representative of Israel was speaking under Rule 37, is inconsistent with the decorum that we expect in this chamber, and I just wanted to register that. I thank you.
And I thank the United States, the representative of the United States, for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.